Well, good morning. This is the September 5th, 2024 meeting of the Technical Advisory Group to the Vermont Public Utility Commission on the Clean Heat Standard. I'm Rick Weston, the chair. Thank you all for joining us. We have a quorum, and I expect others will show shortly. Thank you all for making it. Let's see. Just a couple housekeeping points. It'd be great if TAG members could keep their, if it's at all possible, keep their videos on so that we see everybody on the TAG. But everybody, including public, keep muted when not speaking. And we use the hand function for voting and for sequencing speakers as well. Emily Roscoe, do you have any folks joining you from EVT? Oh.
I see Ben Plotzker.
Yeah, I see Ben. Okay, we got Ben. And from the department, we've got TJ and Matthew. Anyone else?
Yeah, so we have Matthew Bakerpool, Ben Belaski, and I also would like to introduce Alec Ansack, who's our new Director of Efficiency and Energy Resources, who may have been in one of the previous meetings, but just in case you haven't met him.
Welcome, Alec, and welcome others. Great.
Can I just make sure my mic is working?
It is now.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Good. Okay.
I should also say we also have Henry Mock and Brian Cotterill will be joining later. That's the whole team that worked on the potential study. So
great. Lloyd is here. Emily Levin has joined, I see. So we're good to go. Okay. Well, let's start with our usual administrative work. Let's take a look at the, I hope folks had a chance to take a look at the minutes of our last meeting. I would welcome a motion to approve them, or at least, or to start if there are any changes that are needed to them. Okay, well then, how about a motion to approve them?
So moved.
By Brian Woods. All in favor, raise your hands. Okay. Any opposed? Okay. They're approved then. Great. Let's see here. With that, I'll turn it to Deirdre Morris of the Public Utility Commission for any updates. Deirdre.
Sure. So I think just two things.
Oh, you've muted
We just
yourself.
lost your audio for some reason.
Yep.
Let's see. How about, yeah, back in business. Just keeping this group on the loop on expected deliverables. So I think at the last meeting, we talked about the schedule for opinion dynamics deliverables. You all have the emissions rate table and the characterization of grid electricity. We weren't sure if we were going to have the characterization of clean fuels by this meeting. We don't have it quite yet, but it'll definitely be, you can expect it by the next meeting and probably well in advance of the next meeting. And I think the timeline on the, all the widgets in the full TRM is still expected at the beginning of next week. So that should also be circulated well in advance of the next TAG meeting. So that's kind of the timeline on those things. And I do think that presentation that we're expecting on the 19th from Opinion Dynamics will really, the TRM is going to be massive. So they're not going to be walking through page by page of that. But it'll probably be about the results of today's conversation, kind of questions that come out of the emissions rate table. And soon you'll be able to see the characterizations of clean fuels, and imagine that'll be a big part of the discussion as well. But probably about a walkthrough of the TRM. Another thing, just wanted to mention, So a meeting or two ago, I mentioned that, the commission's focusing on the rule at this point, not issuing any more staff straw proposals on amendments of the clean heat standard, but did want to make everyone aware that we issued a request for information, the DDA related docket. So that's the one that ends in INV yesterday, may have shown up this morning. And the intention there is to really collect information about how the DDA role should be structured. Let me just open up that while I have it. And it has a pretty, reasonable timeline. So questions for the RFI are due October 11th. The commission responds to those questions November 1st, and responses are due December 6th. So we're hoping, we kind of hone the function of the DDA with this process, kind of allow prospective DDAs to get more information about the role, and more be able to potentially bid for that appointment in the spring. And just better understand who are the market players that could potentially fill this role. So in the event that this group has any contacts that could that would be good recipients of that we could directly send this RFI to, that would be great. You all can do that yourselves if you have personal contacts, or let me know of ideas or of organizations or entities that would be a good fit to respond to this. Not necessarily would be a good fit to be a DDA. You don't have to be a potential bidder to respond to this, but anyone that would have good ideas about the ultimate DDA structure would be a good recipient of this. I think those are the only two things I have. So happy to answer questions, but otherwise that's it.
Thanks, Deirdre. Any questions for Deirdre? Okay. Well, thank you. Well, let's turn immediately then, if there are no questions on these points, immediately to Matt.
Thanks. Deirdre, is there any understanding or movement or predicted date on when the PUC will answer the motion to reconsider the order regarding early action credits for clean fuels?
The motion to reconsider credit ownership, or?
Yes, the FDA filed a motion to reconsider an order that was issued by the PUC, and didn't know what the timeline is for them to determine what's the next steps in that process.
Fair question. I think that should be coming out. I think the comment deadline closed at the end of last week. So I believe that'll probably be responded to probably in the next week. So that's my anticipation.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, well, let's turn then to the immediate question that you just alluded to, Deirdre, and that's the emissions table from Opinion Dynamics. It was shared in advance a couple days ago. Obviously, OD is not here to answer questions, but really the question for us is, first of all, we'd like to hear what anybody in the TAG has to say about what they've seen so far as they've begun to dig into it. But also the question then is, we'd like to make a decision about whether we reconvene the measures subgroup or the biofuel subgroup to roll up their sleeves next week and really go through the spreadsheet and line up the questions that we want Opinion Dynamics to answer when we see them at our next meeting. Any thoughts on this, Deirdre? Anything to add?
The only thing I would add is, just echoing what you just said, I think it would be advantageous for this group if questions did get sent to Opinion Dynamics ahead of time, so that, of course they can answer questions in real time, but that will allow the most benefit of that presentation, because otherwise I think they would just kind of walk through the memo and walk through what they did. So having some questions identified ahead of time will really help that presentation be the most useful for this group.
Emily Levin?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify sort of what's also coming soon, because it sounds like we're going to be meeting to review what they've already sent, but they're also going to be sending more stuff, including there was something about fuels. So what they've sent, I'm just trying to make sure I understand kind of what they've already sent and what they're planning to send. So what they've sent so far is, tables of emission factors that we could dive into. And then what they will be sending over the next week is the actual complete measure characterizations. And then you were saying those potentially might be divided as, the measure characterization for fuels versus the measure characterization for installed
That's right.
measures, but both of those are coming very soon.
Yep.
So I guess I just wondered if we also have access to those, if the subgroup will be,
Yeah, that's a good.
of those as well.
I think if the subgroup meets mid to late next week, they probably would have the access to the characterizations of the clean fuels and potentially the whole all characterizations of the installed measures as well, which would be a good opportunity for if that group is willing to take the lead on reviewing that as well.
Other thoughts? Patrick?
Good morning. I noticed that they chose to exclude avoided methane emissions from their calculations, and I found that surprising and would like an explanation of why. I know I can't attend the next TAG meeting on the 19th, so would appreciate getting that in writing. And yeah, it seems like a substantial deviation. I'm looking back through my notes from and trying to find the presentation. I forget when they gave it about what they were going to do, and I don't recall hearing that decision as part of their plan. So it seems like a substantial change. So
Thanks, Patrick. Make sure they get that question. Ken?
Yeah, I only had a chance to briefly review the material, so maybe I missed this, but is there a more detailed workbook with regards to the components that lead to the emissions factors? Because I know in the past, there have been, there's the subset, which is the upstream calculations. And to get to Patrick's point, several of these, especially the clean fuels, the low carbon fuels, have things like land use factors and others. So is that going to be available? Because yeah, I look at this and I go, okay, first of all, the numbers seem smaller than what I was imagining for especially the liquid biofuels. But I don't know what to, I mean, I don't know how to review this unless I have more stuff. So is there, A, did I miss more stuff in terms of what was circulated? And B, can we get more detailed workbook material if I didn't miss stuff?
I don't think you missed the stuff. Everything was that we have was sent around by Catherine earlier in the week. So there's a question that we will follow up with Opinion Dynamics on.
I think Deirdre can respond at least initially.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would want to mention is to point folks to the memo.
Right.
Where, I'm sure it doesn't have the level of detail that you might be looking for, but it does, for instance, address counterfactual emission scenarios that they didn't account for any counterfactual scenarios across the board. And I think does also have a section on treatment of land use changes. So again, not claiming that it's to the level of detail that you're looking for, still probably, I imagine, warrants follow-up questions, but just wanted to mention that in case, because the idea with this memo is they tried to a lot of the questions they were deferring from the bioenergy subgroup, for instance, the last couple months, tried to specifically address in the memo that kind of complements the emissions schedule.
Thanks, Deirdre. Patrick, you still have your hand up? Nope, you're good. Then TJ,
Sorry, I thought I put it down.
no problem. No problem.
Well, I just kind of wanted to go back to what Patrick had said, and I know or pointed out, and I know Dr. Gruber had made a comment about not including avoided methane, and I wonder if it's worth some discussion from this group on that point. You know, taking the statute into account and giving some direction to opinion dynamics specifically. I just want to make sure that we don't get to a meeting next week where we're not kind of prepared to give that kind of feedback of you should do this for this issue. And I don't want to, it might be good to have some conversation here, because I feel like there's two different points of view on this that both have could have some legitimacy, and the best way to have it, we could have some of it now and then figure out a process forward.
Oh, sorry.
No, great, TJ. Yes, we have time now between this and the question of grid emissions. We've got some time, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And that certainly was in my mind. Not this specific question, but the idea of getting a subgroup together to dig in more deeply was part of what we had in mind here. But we should start now. I'm all for that. Emily, and then Sam.
I agree. I think that's a really important decision point, and we've been trying to kind of front load some of these decisions, and I think that didn't fully happen in the way I had hoped, and now we're kind of arriving at, we're getting complete draft documents. We are, I also want to note that we're now at a place where we have 3 different consultants with different assumptions for biofuels. We have the NV5 potential study assumptions, we have the opinion dynamics assumptions, which are the ones we really need because that's the actual measure characterization. But I wasn't sure if some of this is going to come up with the NV5 study, because they did include the avoided carbon intensities, and I think opinion dynamics in part they didn't, because it wasn't included in the ANR upstream inventory, which is kind of the third source. So we now have 3 potential resources we could look at that are all using different, arriving at different carbon intensities and assumptions for biofuels. So I don't know. I was hoping we could have done a little bit more of this alignment up front, but it is what it is.
Yeah, well, it is what it is. Are you suggesting that what are you suggesting, Emily, that we start that discussion right now?
Right. Yeah. I mean, for sure. And I guess I'm just acknowledging that, this is going to come up with NV5 as well, I think, because they also have fuel assumptions in some cases of which are very different than the opinion dynamics draft assumptions. So I guess just being aware of that. And I guess it also, to the extent we were going to get to it when we get to the NV5 study, I just,
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, Sam, and then TJ.
I was going to kick off the avoided methane discussion. So if TJ wants to respond first, that's probably better.
Yeah, just really quickly, thanks, Sam. I just want to just responding to Emily's comment there. The potential study, we'll get into this, is determining the carbon reduction potential in the thermal sector really relative to the GWSA requirements, and we kind of look at the life cycle as well as a useful kind of reference point. But as we go forward, I think the opinion dynamics measure characterizations are really what's going to be used to set clean heat credit values. And that so I just want to focus, make sure the attention, we can use the NV5 information as an input to the discussion, but really want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. The opinion dynamics numbers are ultimately the ones that are the measure characterizations that will be used to set clean heat credit values. So that's all on that. Thank you.
Right. Good point. Thank you. Okay, Sam, Emily, your hand's still up. If I can come back to you. Sam, and then Ken. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. So I can help maybe kick off our discussion on avoided methane because, as you guys know, it's an issue that's important to the biogas and RNG industries. So, we've discussed some of this before, but we continue to think that avoided methane inclusion in the life cycle CI score is important because it differentiates the fuels which have a higher upstream impact from the ones that don't. Right. And just to give you an example of this. So let's take a landfill gas derived RNG versus RNG from captured methane at a dairy, right? With avoided methane crediting, you'll be able to see clearly that in this case, the dairy has a strong environmental impact versus the landfill, which has a much smaller upstream methane reduction impact. Without the life cycle CI inclusion of avoided methane, those sources of gas are going to look very similar. So right there, you're sort of conflating, right, two things which could have a completely different environmental impact, and you're foregoing reductions that occur throughout the supply chain, right? And I mean, I do want to reiterate too, for the other biofuels and for RNG resources that don't have avoided methane crediting, other supply chain emissions are still included there, right? So I think it's just important to remember that. Bigger picture here, what we're talking about is creating a market that draws in renewable fuels. And if you look at all of the other programs that operate similarly to the way that the clean heat standard is slated to operate. And what I mean by that is using life cycle CI and using a declining CI score baseline as the target, they all incorporate avoided methane crediting for the biogas and RNG pathways. So, if we're going to do that differently under this program, I think there should be a good reason to do it differently, first of all. Second of all, should point out that, basically that'll cause a market distortion between the programs that use it and the programs that don't. So in other words, those fuels will be much more valuable under, say, one of the LCFS programs than they are under this program. And I think that'll forego the ability to attract certain resources into this program. And third, it would be good just to understand why that decision was made for the values that were sent out the other day. I think it's on some level hard to have this discussion without understanding why we've chosen to do it this way in the first place. So I can stop there. Happy to answer any questions, but I'll turn it over to Ken, Patrick, whoever else.
Ken, then Patrick. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just a quick follow-up on Sam's point, and there, to me, there's two aspects. One is the clean heat standard the only economic tool to encourage methane capture? And I'll say that as a rhetorical question, but I think that's a question the PUC needs to resolve in terms of considering the role in which the clean heat standard is the mechanism to encourage largely out of state investments to do methane capture when there may very well be other programs that also do that. Because to answer what Sam's question, I'm pretty sure the reason why the counterfactuals aren't included is because of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Any reduction that takes place in another sector is not included in thermal. And then the out-of-state piece complicates it further. Reduction in solid waste or in agricultural sectors out of state has even more so less impact. So that's that's a reason. Now, whether it's a good enough reason, it gets to, I think, where a lot of the renewable fuel folks are, is we want to have all the appropriate incentives to encourage the effective use of potential energy sources. And the capture of methane is absolutely beneficial. But because I get back to my initial, is that the role of the clean heat standard to provide all of those incentives? I think it's an open question. But my other is a question maybe Matt can help with and others. And that is that the emission factors for, and I focus on liquid biodiesels, are significantly different. And at the federal level, I know there's that credit program, but when a fuel is delivered into Vermont, what are the characteristics of those renewable liquid fuels? I know it doesn't happen much now, but when it does happen, what are the characteristics of those liquid fuels at this kind of detail or more detail, so that we know specifically the feedstocks, the mechanism to convert the feedstocks into a liquid fuel, so that the credit determination, again, is based upon this significant range. And I look at, corn being one, soy being another. When you get your credits from the feds, do they say that was a corn-based product, therefore, when it comes to Vermont, it should be getting more credits than a soybean-based product? So again, I don't know if any of the folks on the call here can answer that, because we have these numbers, but if we can't differentiate them, we're going to have to blend them somehow, and that's going to raise another question.
Thanks, Ken. Patrick, then Sam.
So I think, just going to try and respond to a variety of points here. I think first is just all along, and I guess I didn't bring this up back over the winter, but the concept of avoided methane being a counterfactual, to me seems to bring up a whole other sort of theoretical question that doesn't match on the ground reality. So if you go to a dairy farm or you go to a landfill, there is methane coming out. If you go to a dairy farm in Vermont in the summer, you can literally go to the manure storage and see the methane actually bubbling out, going straight into the atmosphere. So when you digest that manure, you physically reduce the amount of methane that does actually bubble out. So to me, there is a actual physical connection, and excluding this important component of the greenhouse gas accounting based on something, calling it counterfactual, making it theoretical, doesn't make sense. Certainly the details of how it gets done are important and need to be considered, and those can be debated, but just blanket excluding it completely doesn't make sense to me. And to sort of speak to one of Sam's points and answer one of Ken's, there absolutely are other market incentives to drive methane reductions from animal agriculture. There are not many in Vermont. I don't think, aside from maybe some grants or things like that, there are not many Vermont sponsored or any Vermont sponsored programs nor market-based programs to do that. The Vermont Speed program does it indirectly. But I don't think, to speak to Ken's question, I don't think our job as the tag is necessarily to be considering that policy question of whether other market incentives should be used for this purpose. It's to determine what is the appropriate way to do it in this program that has been created. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Patrick. Sam and then TJ.
Thanks, Patrick. Just first of all, agree with the points that Patrick made and wanted to respond to one of Ken's points that I thought was a really, really important aspect of this. So alignment with the GWSA, right? And needing to ensure that out of sector portions of the life cycle process, right, align with what we're doing here that makes a lot of sense to me as a lens through which to look at different carbon accounting scenarios. I think it's just important to point out, right, that when we're talking about out of sector reductions, number one, none of those out of sector reductions, whether it's avoided methane, or I think let's use the case of a liquid biofuel that has upstream land use change emissions added to the life cycle score. Those are not being included in Vermont's inventory at the state level for the thermal sector, right? That's not happening in any other state where they use life cycle accounting either. So for example, California's LCFS program, we always use this example, they're not crediting the transportation sector with avoided methane emissions. They're also not crediting the transportation sector with upstream land use change emissions. Those emissions occur in their respective sectors. They're crediting the transportation sector with point of use emissions. So, right, for a biofuel, that's biogenic CO2. For a fossil fuel, it's CO2. It could be for an EV, right, an avoidance of fossil CO2. So it's just important to remember that because we are, in fact, using life cycle carbon intensity scoring under this program, the nature of that requires us to include out of sector portions of the life cycle score in the analysis that is used to generate the credits. So I guess we can draw that line wherever we want in terms of avoided methane, ILUC, emissions from processing and transport of the fuels. But, you know, there's not a fundamental difference between avoided methane or ILUC or these other upstream interactions in terms of how they relate to the GWSA targets, right? If you were doing this based on thermal sector emissions, all of the resources would be assessed at point of use carbon intensity.
Thanks. Before I go to TJ, I want to just take a look at the clock. We set aside a half an hour to talk about this question and the grid emissions question. The grid emissions question, I think, can be relatively quickly addressed. But in both cases, one thing I want us to keep in mind is really the procedural question. How do we want to proceed? And does it make sense for a group of us to get together toward the end of next week to dig into these issues and identify the questions that we want to ask Opinion Dynamics? But this is ultimately going to take us to a point where the tag is, we're going to want to say something about this, and you know, we'll take a vote on how on what it is we want to say. So I would certainly think that a subgroup meeting would be helpful in paving a pathway to an ultimate set of statements from the tag on these questions. That's my thought. I welcome others. But let's go to TJ and then Floyd and see where we stand.
I'll be brief. I support, a task group, kind of looking at this and bringing it back for a vote next meeting. I just wanted to point out, and I put in the chat that Act 18, the statute, really addresses this issue. I think in my mind, I think as far as statutes are, this one is pretty clear in my mind. And so I could be wrong, so I just put it there for people to interpret and let the process take its path.
Thanks, TJ. Floyd, and then Sam.
Yeah, thanks. I think I have myself unmuted, right?
You do. You're double unmuted, Floyd.
To the earlier point made, I think maybe Sam or someone made it. I just wanted to distinguish, and I don't claim to have any knowledge about what the thought process was in coming up with the emission factors that were released earlier this week, but I do want to make a distinction between upstream biogenics and out of state activities resulting in emission impacts. So the upstream biogenics for plant-based feedstocks, that occurs as part of the fuel production itself. It's not an activity per se. It is part of developing that feedstock, whether you're talking about a waste lipid, a waste oil, or whether you're talking about a vegetable oil feedstock. It's all involving plant matter that is growing, and in that growing, it's taking up CO2 from the atmosphere that offsets the CO2 that comes out of the tailpipe or the smokestack. Okay, so that it's completely proper to account for that in a life cycle assessment score. Whereas something like an indirect land use change, I would argue, is an outside activity that's occurring, well, theoretically that's occurring. It's not really something you can measure, but it could occur outside the state where the other crops or other plants are being grown to replace, theoretically, again, the feedstock that's being used to provide fuel. The problem we've seen in the jurisdictions that use that concept is that the theory doesn't really match what's happening on the ground. Okay, so in California, for example, we've had more than a decade's worth of field observations to ground truth, the sort of projections that were used to come up with ILUC scores that were initially in the 300 gram CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And just for context, petroleum diesel is scored at 100. So there were scientists that were projecting ILUC scores 3 times petroleum diesel for biofuels. And then you move forward, the science has evolved. That went down to 60, and then a few years later down to 29.1. The latest work by Purdue puts that at about 10, for example. So we've seen a greater than, I think, 95% reduction in that estimate of the indirect land use change. My point being that, it's a speculative modeling exercise at best. It's not something that you can directly measure, and difficult to kind of assign certainty to. And so, to me, the factors that NV5 put out there are reflective of what's being produced. I think there are fuels that are lower than that, certainly, but I think it's entirely within the range of the CI scores that we've seen on the West Coast.
Thank you, Floyd. Sam, then Patrick.
Thanks, Rick. First, happy to move forward with a resolution on this any way that you see fit. So if we want to set up a separate group, happy to do that. Second, thank you, TJ, for adding the definition to the group chat. What I wanted to point out about the definition, right, is it says account for methane emissions, reductions, or captures already occurring or expected to occur, ... based on local, state, or federal requirements that have been enacted or adopted. So the way that the life cycle CI models are set up typically accounts for that exactly. And I think that's a really important point here. So, you know, if you look at a landfill gas pathway for biogas, there's gas capture already occurring, which is why there's no avoided methane crediting, unless there's a regulation in a given state that says, look, we're capping all dairy methane, which there isn't, right, in any state that I'm aware of. Under that text that was sent by TJ, you would count avoided methane emissions as part of the CI score, right? That's the whole basis of the thought process that takes place in the other jurisdictions that do this. So that's my interpretation. That's consistent with what we've seen in every other jurisdiction that does this. If folks think I'm wrong about that, certainly open-minded, but that's consistent. The other thing, you know, I think that's important to maybe point out here, well, I'll reiterate, right? We haven't heard any reasoning for why avoided methane crediting is omitted from the current numbers. And I think that would be helpful. I also haven't heard anyone here say that we shouldn't do this. And I imagine there are people that think we shouldn't, and would love to hear, you know, that side of the discussion as part of our conversation today.
That suggests another reason that we get together next week. I think that would be important. Patrick.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll be quick here, and also just a thank you to TJ for sharing that language, and really just a question for TJ. I also think it's clear, and just wondering, do you, TJ, think this is saying that avoided methane emissions should be included, or do you think it's saying that they shouldn't be? And obviously, yes, we should have more discussion, but just since you thought it was very clear, wanted to see.
Yeah, so I'm still open to being told I'm wrong. I'm not a lawyer, but I read it that way, that it says it account for and credit all avoided methane emissions except for if there are requirements. And, you know, not knowing the industry as well, I think of that if there was a requirement for flaring, right, then that is now the baseline. You know, some industries have those requirements, and you know, like in some landfills, for instance, already required to flare as part of their permit. And so I would think that would be then the baseline. You don't get to count the kind of, you know, if the methane emissions as if there weren't flaring. But I am definitely open to hearing other interpretations, but that's my base reading.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm in agreement, but thanks.
So I see there's more hands going up, and it's every time the new comments, I'm wondering, Rick, if this is in fact the conversation that needs to happen, the subgroup, and
It is.
we should just.
It is. And I thank you, Catherine. I do want to cut this off, but Brian hasn't had a chance to say anything, so I'd give him a moment, and then I'll say how I think we ought to go on. Well, Floyd's back.
Well, you can't let me talk and then cut Floyd off, right? That's not fair.
Yeah, but let's do this quickly, and then
I'm
gonna
gonna stop. If we're convening a work group, we can have that discussion there. I think it's more appropriate there, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Floyd, I'll give you 15 seconds.
Just real quickly, to affirm what I think TJ and Sam or someone else said. The interpretation of this language is how it's done on the West Coast. So it's pathway specific. If the RNG is coming from a state that has regulations requiring digesters or capping of landfills, and that's accounted for. And if it's not, then avoided methane gets credited. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's convene a group next week. I would suggest to start that we look at roughly this time frame, Thursday, maybe start at 10:30 in the morning and give it an hour and a half, 2 hours at least. We can do a doodle poll or whatever, if that time can work for everybody, and you know right now that it will, we'll set that up. I will add to that the question of grid emissions. Opinion Dynamics has sent us a spreadsheet on that work as well, which I began to dig into this week, and I need to give it a good deal more thought. But I'll say on the basis of a limited review of it, I think they capture what I think needs to happen in emissions, accounting from the grid as a general matter. Ultimately, their approach, more in my view, from what I can tell so far, is sort of more of a proxy approach than an actual approach that recognizes changes in Vermont's portfolio of resources, which ultimately is what we're responsible for, what Vermont is responsible for, and what our investment decisions over the long term will cause to happen. That's where I'm coming from on this, and I think that what they've shown so far is largely consistent with that. Especially, as you know, we've got a 2035, all renewable portfolio requirement that has associated with it quite low emissions of greenhouse gases. And I think that what they've done so far, again, I've only begun to look at it, and others I'm sure want to look at it closely too. I would just add, I would throw that question into the mix of this subgroup as well. And we can spend some time on that next week. That's my recommendation to folks. Catherine, I'll turn it to you to organize us.
Well, I guess a question that stands out still for me is who is in the subgroup. So we've had the discussion we're having now has focused on the biofuels portion of the emissions. We'll be getting more information on that. Does that mean it goes back to the bioenergy group and others that might want to join, given this is a much more in-depth conversation now? And then there's the measures characterization group that has been meeting based on what we've been getting on the installed measures. And that would include the electricity emissions, I'm assuming, as well. So we've had these two groups that have been stood up. How do we want to proceed? Do we want to just create a whole new group and get a whole new set of volunteers? Presumably not the entire tag, but
my reaction, I'll just start as a straw proposal, is that we create a new group. In other words, we just give it another title, but it's still a subgroup that's going to talk to all of these questions. I think that they're all coming together now. But if others think that we can keep them separate in some way, let's do that. Any reactions?
Well, if we create a whole new group, then I am going to, I guess I'd like to make sure that it is not the entire tag, or we should just have another tag meeting. So can folks that are interested in being in this group raise your hand so I can know exactly how many folks we're talking about here? I'm seeing none.
For my part, Matthew will participate for the Public Service Department.
10.
I just have a quick question. I'm happy to participate, mostly listening in. I'm not an expert on this topic, but if a memo is sent out plenty in advance, I can sit out if we're trying to whittle the number down.
Okay, so 9 or 10. Ken, you're not going to participate? Okay. I didn't capture all of the names, but I should probably, so I can get this scheduled with you.
So Catherine, is 9, sorry to interrupt, is 9 or 10 a quorum for the tag? And so does that just turn into a tag meeting?
It would have to be publicly noticed, definitely, and public, yes. So, but it would be a subgroup of which the public is invited to attend.
And we would not be making any decisions on behalf
Thank
of
you.
the tag.
That's the distinction. Yeah.
That'd
which-
be
That's the key
yes.
to know. And just to be clear, I raised my hand, but on Matthew's behalf, so
Right.
it's not, yeah.
All right. Well, I will, if I don't get all the names correctly, Floyd, Patrick, Casey, Michelle, okay. All right, then, is everybody good with next Thursday at 9:30 or 10?
No,
Brian said he's away, and I'm away and totally offline the whole following week, so might have to be Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday next week.
Well, they're not getting the info, we're not gonna get additional information until early next week, so you won't have much more to work with, but,
What is
Yeah.
Friday? How about Friday?
Brian said he's away then.
You still away, Brian?
yeah, Patrick's doing a great job managing my schedule. It's awesome. I've never had an executive assistant before.
Happy to help.
Well, what about Monday of the following week?
I'm away the entire week of the 16th. So like the 23rd, 24th.
that's like the day before the meeting. You won't be able to
Well, the
prepare.
next tag meeting is on the 19th, right?
Oh, right. So that's when the
I'm talking
presentation
about the
will be
week.
made. So the idea is to have this conversation before the actual presentation is made.
I think we're gonna have to have it next week. And for folks who can't make it, it'll be recorded and we'll just have to circle back.
Is there any time on Wednesday that's an option?
Well, the question then is, once again, Deirdre can't make a promise, but it'd be great if we'd have the additional information by then.
Yeah, I think it will probably come early next week, but I don't want to.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm honestly like, how long is this meeting gonna be if we have to both review all the emission factor spreadsheets that we already have and discuss this avoided methane issue? That's easily an hour without even addressing any additional information we might get.
This will be a 2-hour meeting, so, okay, so the question is it Wednesday afternoon or Thursday?
I'm
Is
available
there-
Wednesday afternoon between 12:30 and 3.
You are or not?
I am on the 11th between 12:30 and 3.
Yeah, I am too.
Okay, Catherine.
Does that work for you, Brian?
No.
Oh,
Well, it seems like, Brian, is there any time that works for you? That we've talked about?
No, not that we've talked about.
Okay.
Schedule as you need to, or maybe I can get someone else to cover, or I'll find a friendly participant to share my views.
Okay. Thank you.
Maybe you, Patrick.
Okay. And we'll try to put together a skeletal agenda so that we get all the topics identified. So we'll follow up with several of you for that early next week. Okay. We're off and running. Let's see.
so it's gonna be like 12:30 to 3 on the 11th.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. Has Matt Coda come back?
He was there.
He just left I thought he left a message just briefly. Because he's next on the agenda. We might have to do a little flip-flop here. Casey, your hand is up. Oh, Matt is texting me. Hang on a sec. Let me, okay, he says 10 minutes. So we ought to, what's next on the agenda, Catherine? Can we go to that?
We have the equity advisory group, if Emily can do that on without. So that we can get that wrapped up. Emily Roscoe, are you able to give us an update on the equity advisory group at this point?
Yes. Yep.
Great.
So the EAG heard from Claire McIlveny. I apologize if I got that last name wrong, in pronunciation, but Claire, gave a talk to the Equity Advisory Group this week on, she's the Data and Equity Policy Manager from the Department of Public Service, and Claire talked about Act 154, the Environmental Justice Act, for awareness for the EAG as we move forward in writing the Equity Advisory Group report that's due January 15th, I believe. So that was helpful. We continue to touch base about that report, and moving forward, we'll be writing out sections independently to share and edit during Equity Advisory Group meetings to comply with the open meeting law. There were some questions around gaps in the writing process of the report as it relates to unknown costs, but Ben Lasky from the department reminded the group about cost information being in the potential study report that was just released this week. And the group moved a memo forward to the Public Utilities Commission on DDA requirements as it relates to equity and equity plans. And that can be found in the meeting materials. And a general question that the group had for the tag was just a check-in. Generally, is there anything we need to connect on between the two groups? So if anyone has any questions or additions to those updates or thoughts, and if there's anything we should be checking in on, now would be the time.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, Matt Coda is, well, he's still on this other call. He's listening to us, but he's still on the other call. I don't know, it's
Our 5-minute break now then, and then come back, and folks can come back in 5 minutes. He should be ready about 25 till.
that's what I was gonna, good idea.
All right. All right, let's do that and reconvene in 5 minutes. Thanks all.
Thanks.
Oh, there's Matt. Trying to be readmitted.
Yeah, let's give it a minute. Other folks show up.
So Matt, we took a short break and so we're ready for you to start. Ready to go.
Looks like he disappeared again.
No, there he is. He's just moved to my page 2. Matt, are you ready at this point? He's there. There you go. He's unmuted. Matt?
Okay.
All right. All right, well, let's pick it up. It's over to you, Matt, for your memo and ask of the tag. And I guess that's an important part that might help us before we get into any discussion is just to be clear about what it is that you are hoping the tag will do.
Yes, that's thank you for that redirect, Catherine. And just to provide an explanation, you know, representing, as I have for 2 decades now, the individuals that will either earn credits by installing clean heat measures or selling equipment that could earn a clean heat measure to someone, we don't know who because we haven't established that yet, or those that sell fuel in Vermont, and then those that sell fuel in Vermont that would become an obligated party. These are the questions that I get asked repeatedly, and as a member of the TAG, I'd say, well, I don't know the answer yet. And the response is always, well, aren't you a member of the technical advisory group and shouldn't you know this? And that's what really created this 9-page memo in which it's almost like an open letter saying, here are the questions that we don't know the answer to and that we will need to know the answer to. And here's some direction that we think would be helpful if the Public Utility Commission decided to go down this path, or if they feel that they can't or think that they can't because the statute doesn't allow it, to provide an opportunity to have an amendment to Act 18 or a revision to Act 18 that would. And I'm happy to discuss any of the points in the memo, but the 3 big ones, just to remind everyone, what's of concern is how do the obligated parties pay the clean heat fee? Now, maybe that's not a terminology that everyone uses, but I've sort of, in my mind, you either produce credits because you've created them yourself and you own them, or you purchase them on a credit exchange, or you bartered for them with someone that can produce credit by delivering clean heat measures, or what you've done is you've said, no, I'm not going to produce any credits. I'm just going to sell fossil fuel. And so I'm going to tell you that, and then I'm going to pay the fee based on prior year obligation. And that's what I've called the clean heat fee. Or there's the clean heat fee plus fine, which is in statute as 2 times what you should have paid because you either didn't or didn't plan accordingly. So the clean heat fee would effectively be the ceiling price. Again, this is my interpretation. Feel free to say, Matt, you've got it all wrong, or I view it a different way. But my interpretation is an obligated party based on their prior year sales would be responsible for paying a fee in lieu of credits if they don't show credits, or credits plus a fee, what they're minus of. And so how does that payment occur? Does it occur once a year? Does it use quarterly? Does it occur monthly? Does it occur on the existing forms that some but not all of the obligated parties use, such as the form that they file on the 25th of the month every month to pay the 2 cent per gallon fuel tax, which is called Form FGR 615? Is it on the CVO 102, which is the excise tax form that gasoline and diesel taxpayers pay to the Department of Motor Vehicles? Or is it some other device? We know that the Public Utility Commission is used to sending out quarterly, I believe it's quarterly, bills to the 17 electric utilities so that they pay their fees to their regulator. It's not going to work. I'm going to state it plainly. It is not going to work. Depending on how the PUC rules, you've got 200 different entities that come and go every year. You're always going to have around 200, but they're going to change. 50 of them are going to come one year, not come the other. And depending on how you rule regarding propane cylinders, that number could grow exponentially. Sending out quarterly or annual statements based on prior year's obligation, my fear, quite plainly, is it's not going to work. It's not going to collect the money that you're anticipating. I think in order to run a program, there needs to be a system, one that's, in my view, already in place to collect the money in lieu of credits. So that's number one. And we would like the tag, I would like the tag to say, yeah, this one is preferable and have a discussion, or to just say, the PUC should give some direction to the obligated parties in the draft rule that's due in 3 weeks about how the collection method is actually going to occur. Because without money, this program doesn't work. Number two, how do we account for our clean heat credits that obligated parties want to show in lieu of paying the clean heat fee? So there will be a universe, not all, but some, of obligated parties that will be required to pay a fee based on prior year sales, but they don't want to pay the fee. They would rather show that the work that they're doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for their customers, they want to validate that and show that so that they pay less of a fee to the default delivery agent through the whatever mechanism we create for the clean heat fee. How do they identify those, and when do they? What's the schedule of doing that? Thanks to the conversations I've had with the PUC, and thank you to Deirdre, we understand much better now about how we are going to attach obligations based on prior year sales. But we still have clean heat measures, either clean fuels, which are being delivered to consumers, or equipment. And how do we account for those in order to lower our clean heat fee, our obligation cost? I guess what I'm asking the tag is to say, yeah, we agree with Matt that that's important, and the PUC should put that into their draft rule. And then I'm speaking on behalf of the heating and cooling contractors, the ones that don't sell any fuel. They'll never be obligated, but they do install the equipment that absolutely this law and this rule wants them to do, whether we're talking about heat pump water heaters, solar PV, weatherization, modern wood heating. They do all this. They're asking me as their representative here to say, how do I account for this? How do I monetize this? Yeah, I understand government wants me to do it. I'm doing it. I'll do more of it. But how do I actually turn a job into a credit, into money? And I don't know, but they need to know. And so that's, again, I don't know if any of us know how that happens, but certainly it should be in the rule. And that's it. And I'm happy to ask any questions.
Thank you, Matt. Ken.
Yeah, I appreciate the presentation and the thought that went into it from Matt. And I want to kind of focus the question to us tag members is if, and it's a focus on that, the difference between using prior year sales and I'll call it real-time sales, where you've sold a certain amount, whether it be in a month or a quarter, and that then determines your obligation. So my question to the tag, and maybe it can't be, well, my question to the tag is, from a technical perspective, from the accounting of emissions, from the estimation of number of credits, is there any downside to moving from prior year sales to real-time sales? And I want to add one modification to Matt's proposal, which I think is very consistent with statute and what I think is necessary to help the default delivery agent. And that is, statute includes this mechanism for planning of obligated parties that wish to, that plan to carry out some functions to reduce their obligation. So my thinking is that those plans, and we can talk about how detailed they need to be and how rigid they need to be adhered to, but those plans are a basis for real-time accounting to net out the credit obligation for that real-time period. So if you sold 100,000 gallons of fuel oil, but you had, and let's say that requires you to have 1,000 credits, but in your plan, because of the sale of a lower carbon fuel or participation in the installation of heat pumps or any of the installed measures, you planned to account for 500 credits, then you would only need to pay the fee, as Matt calls it, for the 500 credits. And to get what I think is Matt's second point, yeah, it is going to be after the fact that credit affirmation takes place. And certainly with installed measures. With delivered fuels, I don't know. And Matt, how those delivered fuels are actually related to their lower carbon content, whether that can happen in real time or not, I don't know. But that, I'm sure that can all be worked out. But in terms of installed measures, yeah, some point after the fact, some sort of certification that an installed measure was installed and is operating, then you go and say, okay, we planned on 500. Okay, maybe it was only 450, and I would hope the PUC would have some latitude in plan approval that sort of change wouldn't lead to a penalty. It might lead to a future obligation, but again, this is the mechanism. But again, I ask from a tag perspective, does that screw up the estimation of credits, the measuring of actual emissions? Does it provide perverse incentives to reduce installed measures or delivered measures? I don't think it does, but if it does, I think that's where we could weigh in to see if there's some way to refine the proposal. But in general, I support Matt's proposal strongly.
Matt,
Thank you. Thank you, Ken.
Can I just summarize what I think Ken just said right there, and Ken, please disagree with me. Not talking about installed measures right now, just talking about delivered clean fuels that earn credit. The distance between the obligation, which is prior year, and the fuels that are being delivered, which you can account for on the 25th of the month every month, that needs to shrink in my mind. And it needs to shrink from a compliance perspective, from an enforcement perspective, but also to recognize the real market changes that happen. Yes, there is a population of obligated parties that purchase some of their fuel in advance. And in that calculation, they can determine whether or not they are going to get a forward contract for a renewable fuel and how much is renewable and how much is, all those calculations are going to be done by some. It won't be in their entire obligation, but it will be some of it. Why do we know this? Because they do it now. They're called guaranteed price contracts or pre-buys, and the law says you have to buy 75% of the product in a forward contract whenever you sell a pre-buy contract to your customer. But that's never all of the gallons that they sell, and not everyone offers these programs, and not everyone has the capital, especially the small dealers in rural areas, in order to do that type of investment. Instead, they pay as they go, and their customers pay as they go. And that competition helps what drives down prices. So for that universe, which I think deserves protection, that has the most at risk under a very stringent and complex regulatory regime, having the ability to pay as they go their obligation on the 25th of the month based on sales the prior month, but yet lower that number based on the credible clean fuels that they also deliver during that same time period. From an accounting perspective and from the ability for small fuel dealers in order to comply with the law and to incentivize their customers and them to sell more clean fuels, that seems like a positive move that the PUC could take. And I don't know if they need legislation to do it. And I don't know if they agree that it solves some of their problems. Because as I see it, if you're looking backwards at calendar year 25, not heating season 25, 26, but calendar year 25, and you're establishing an obligation, and the fuel dealer is supposed to come up with a plan on how they are going to account for their credits and either write a check, depending on how that happens, monthly, quarterly, annually, or to in fact show that
the obligation that they incur by delivering the fuels from fuel purchased out of state and delivered into state, which 80% of them do, versus, and then the clean fuels that they are blending into their product to reduce that obligation. Yes, PUC must verify that after the fact, but if they verify it monthly rather than annually, it seemed to be a much better way to enforce this and make sure that the fuels that are being delivered are the ones that they say they are. So from a compliance perspective, I think that's preferable.
Yeah, Ken, you were up next. Sorry, jumped the line.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Matt, I just want to go back to your first three questions on what it's a process issue. You laid out 3 points. Am I correct in understanding them in this way, that only the first of the 3 points would require a statutory change? That the second 2 points require PUC action in the proposed rule? Is that correct?
This is where I say I'm not a lawyer. I'm not sure. And I've heard different opinions expressed by lawyers and non-lawyers about whether that's required. I think from a tag perspective, maybe it's best to say, I don't know. I'm not going to speak for the tag, but my thought was the tag could say, this is how it should happen. If this requires a statutory change, then so be it. But the lawyers on staff should be able to tell us.
Just a quick clarification, because I've got the memo, but I'm unclear if Matt's recommendations were in the same order as the memo. When you said first point, which is that first point?
I'm referring to the prior year versus current year.
Okay, that's just wanted to confirm. Thank you.
Yeah, essentially, it's all in one. And that's a good question, Emily. It's all sort of wrapped up in one big box, ribbon, whatever you want to call it. It's how do we pay it, and when do we pay it, and do we pay it based on prior year, or do we pay it as we go? As for instance, every fuel company has done since 1990 to pay the fuel tax that funds low income weatherization. You know, we're using an existing model. And how are you going to alter it for a clean heat fee to, or is there going to be an entirely new methodology of which to collect money from those fossil fuel sellers who bring fuel into Vermont for ultimate consumption in Vermont that don't have offsetting credits? How does that payment work? And is it monthly? Is it quarterly? Is it annually? How far is the look back? Are we looking back 25 days? Are we looking back 21 months? All these questions need answers.
Right. And I think you're right, Matt. The tag doesn't have to, and shouldn't, as you say, necessarily take a position on whether the statute needs changing. Just that here's what we think ought to happen, and let the folks who make the decisions decide how to do it. That's fine. So Matt, let me be direct. Are you asking us to support this statement?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes. I'm not suggesting we have the answers today, or should come up with a response. I think these questions have to be answered by the Public Utility Commission, or have to be a conversation with the Public Utility Commission. But I've just listed a bunch of known unknowns, and I don't know how you run this program without answering these questions. I mean, that's just my opinion.
Okay. I'll just say that as a general matter, I'm speaking from obviously myself. I think the points you raise are reasonable and and appropriate for resolution by either the PUC or the legislature. As written, you've got one sentence in your memo that I don't support, but it doesn't change. It doesn't change a single thing in your main points. And the sentence that I would want to rewrite is when you talk about the guarantee of utility profits. It's not a guarantee. It's an opportunity for a reasonable. It's a fair opportunity for earning a reasonable rate of return. It's not a guarantee, but that would be the only change.
Fair
point. So I'm open to hearing what folks have to say. We could I'll turn to Brian. Go ahead.
So, yeah, thank you, Matt. I 100% agree that these questions need to be answered. But I'm just looking back at the list of the responsibilities of the tag, and I don't see that. This would be a great question for the administrative advisory group. I'm not at all clear that this is a question that needs to be addressed by the technical advisory group. But I bring that to the attention of the members for their consideration. I mean, there is this other matters referred by the PUC to the tag, which this isn't one of them, but I suppose it could be. So yeah, I mean, I want to reiterate, I think everything you're saying is absolutely legitimate. I'm just not at all clear that this is the group that is tasked to either weigh in on them or otherwise provide some kind of solutions.
Understood.
Emily?
Yeah, I have some of those same concerns. And as well, when I think there's some really useful points raised that likely do need to be considered by the PUC and administrators and implementers of the program. But I certainly wouldn't be comfortable with the tag weighing in with kind of a broader statement of support, because I think that opens up questions of the implications of that. Like, to what extent are we reopening the whole clean heat standard, and why haven't we just done a more straightforward, fee on thermal fuels for many years in the past? And, is this a fee or a tax? And there's just a lot of implications, both policy and political, of opening this back up and to what degree we open it back up. And given that the tag doesn't really have a policy responsibility, but rather a technical responsibility, I just feel nervous about formally weighing in. I think to the extent any of these issues have a very clear nexus to a technical question before us, so questions of like clean heat valuation, if we were to decide, it really is going to be hard to do this based on prior year sales, and that's going to throw off the whole valuation process. I would need to, I still don't fully understand it, to be honest. So I'm not quite at the point of being at that point, but I could see us weighing in on like a narrower point in that way. But this just feels too policy oriented for me to feel comfortable having the tag weight.
Thank you.
Ken?
Yeah, and that was kind of the point that I tried to raise earlier, that when looking at this from a technical perspective, is there anything that raises flags to us? So my suggestion is that feedback to the Public Utility Commission with regards to this proposal is sort of in the absence of a negative, because it's where I am, but I'm really asking others if I'm missing anything. By moving to this approach, does it affect the pieces that we do talk about a great deal? Does it affect the way in which we measure emissions? Does it affect the way in which we characterize an installed clean heat measure? As I say, I think the answer is no, and I think that if we offer to the Public Utility Commission, from the topics that we have been discussing for the last 8 months, this proposal does not alter our understanding and does not lead to any negative repercussions to the technical aspects. Let's say that's what I think we could communicate. And then you're right, it is the policy question. And I think, Matt's laid out good reasons for the policy question that the PUC can and should review. And yes, it's going to maybe require them to pose statutory language, and that's a big deal. Got it. But at least the technical advisory group can weigh in and say, from the issues that we discuss, there is no negative impact from what Matt's proposal is. That's what I would suggest we could communicate.
Thank you.
As a practical matter, then, to take that route, we could just make, come up with a 2-sentence statement that is in effect in response to Matt's July 29th filing. Would that be right? Is that the way to think about it? Is that the right date, Matt?
Yeah, that I agree with Ken's point. There's and Emily's point. And Brian, there's lots of policy points in here, and obviously I have a different rhetoric than the average tag member. But as Rick pointed out, but I don't think whatever the cost of this is, whatever the value of the credits are, this is about the organization and when they're accounted for and when they're paid for. And this is very much focused on process, and it's a reaction to the Stroud proposal, and it's a little bit of a desperation on my part, saying I don't know how to explain how this is going to work to those people who are either going to be earning credits or having to acquire credits. And I think that there can be a way to simplify this. And I don't think it, as Ken suggested, I don't think it harms the ability of this program to encourage the adoption of clean fuels and clean heat measures. So that's it.
So Rick, can I suggest we take Floyd's comment and then wrap this up and, not make a decision at this meeting, but if there is specific language that, for instance, Rick, you would like to craft that reflects some of this discussion and bring it back at the next meeting, would that be appropriate? And let me ask for Floyd for your comment first, before anybody answers.
Yeah, real quick. Having the experience with credit markets on the West Coast in both the cap and trade program and the LCFS, and I understand the perspective that there's some policy considerations here, but I do want to just make the point that a well-functioning market, which I hope everyone's goal is, relies on very clear rules and procedures and the sort of things that Matt is getting at that need clear answers. And those rules and procedures need to apply both at the high level as well as the nuts and bolts sort of aspects that that Matt's talking about. It's very important for all the parties participating in this type of program to understand who does what, when, how, and all of those things. So fully support Matt's perspectives there, and I just want to make the point that as a tag member, I think it behooves us to consider how a program would work and what would be negatively impacted if such clear rules are not addressed or such points are not addressed clearly. Thanks.
Thank you, Floyd. Catherine, I think your approach is sensible. I would be happy to draft a 2, maybe 3-sentence statement that the tag could consider adopting in response to Matt's July 29th filing, along the lines that Ken is suggesting, and Floyd as well. I agree. This is, how does it work? This is a technical question. We do not see at this point. I mean, we can discuss it and accept it or reject it as we wish and amend it, but we would say we do not. We could say we do not see at this point any adverse impacts on the matters that we have been tasked to consider from Matt's proposal, and leave it at that. I'll be happy to draft that for the next meeting, and it can be a discussion.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I guess my only addendum to that, that process sounds good to me. For those of us that maybe weren't part of the credit ownership subgroup and aren't as immersed in these issues, it would be very helpful for me to have an extremely clear synopsis of this is the way it's currently supposed to work. This is the very specific proposal that Matt has for how it's supposed to work. Because I'm reviewing I'm trying to find the July 29th comments, but I was reviewing like the August memo, the August 20-something memo. So I've just lost track a little bit on what exact thing we're reacting to. So
that's a
clarity on that.
That's a really good point, Emily. Sorry to interrupt you, but yes, it's the July 29th is well, it's also my wedding anniversary, but the straw proposal came out on the 29th. The response to the straw proposal distributed to the tag, which is the 9-page piece, that was August 27th. So yes, thank you for clearing that up, Emily.
Yeah,
Okay,
and I'm
looking out
sorry
for the
just
business.
on your wedding anniversary
That's
writing.
all right.
Your-
I'll get it straight. I'm sorry. That was the date I remembered. Okay.
So that sounds like the plan for now, and that leaves us only a few minutes shy of or over for turning this over to Matthew Baker Poole and NV5.
Thanks. I think I'm gonna start
TJ?
here,
Okay.
Catherine. Yeah, and
I say TJ will take the intro.
All right.
I do have a couple of slides here for myself, and then I'll turn it over to NV5. I am going to, it looks like I have
Yep.
the ability to share. Okay. Can folks see my screen here?
We can. It's not in slide view mode, but we can see it.
Is it
Yeah, you might want to put it in slide view or
oh
whatever that's
it's
called.
not, there we
Slide
go.
show. Slide
There we
show.
go.
There you go.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so really quickly, I just wanted to provide a quick introduction to the thermal sector carbon reduction potential study. And that's really what it is. It's what is the potential for carbon reduction in the thermal sector specifically. The purpose of the potential study, it compares first it compares the obligations of the GWSA to the emissions reductions that are potentially achievable in the thermal sector. And you've seen some of the methodology drafts, and we've gotten a lot of good feedback, and NV5 will kind of summarize what's changed and what the results are. But I just want to be really clear that the core purpose of the potential study is to determine whether there's sufficient resources available for the clean heat standard to actually meet those greenhouse gas reduction requirements. Okay, that is the main purpose of the potential study. And very specifically, the potential study is not an implementation plan. So that means that while there is cost information in the report, and that cost information can be used as inputs for estimation or creation of an implementation plan that has costs, the results of this potential study should not be considered a cost of the clean heat standard. Let's just say that again so that everybody is clear and that nobody leaves this meeting and says the clean heat standard is going to cost X, right? So that optimized results in the potential study should not be considered a cost of the clean heat standard. So how do we get to the cost? Well, we've recommended a process here because the clean heat standard potential study, the carbon reduction potential study, has a lot of great information from measure costs to different requirements and how we might reach our targets. We want to follow what the legislature has really directed. So the legislature asked the commission to issue a report by January 15th, as we all know, and it includes the cost information, including high, medium, low price impacts, kind of the last section of the copied language there. So what we suggested is that the commission conduct a process to solicit comments and reply comments on the estimated impacts of the clean heat standard, what the cost might be. So implementation, what might actual implementation in Vermont look like? And again, the potential study and the workbooks, which are all available on our website, can and should be a critical input to the checkback report. So really looking for, it's not just the department that is coming up with a cost estimate. It is all participants to the proceedings can come up with a cost estimate. And the commission can, based on the information, kind of like typical proceedings, can adjudicate that information and come up with a result. That's all I wanted to do the intro for, and just say thank you. So, you know, we've gone through a couple of iterations with the technical advisory group, and comments and feedback have really been appreciated. And we've made some significant changes to NV5 has made some significant changes to the potential study based on the feedback, and it has been really important and valuable. The report, the available workbooks, and comment responses. So those specific comments, we get a lot of comments in writing, other comments in these meetings, we track them, and how the potential study either incorporates, or if not, why it doesn't incorporate those recommendations or comments. And so that's all available at this website at the Public Service Department's website. So with that, I'm going to try to exit out from sharing here. Perhaps I've done that already. And turn it over to NV5, Ben Cartwright and Matt Sachs in particular.
So, TJ, you need to stop sharing.
There it is. Thank you. I couldn't find that for a second. Thank you.
Can I ask a clarifying question before we hear from the consultants? I just want to clarify the framing. Like, the study is completely done at this point, right? So this is final, and if we have things we might have wanted to fix or, provide input, that ship has sailed. We're just viewing the results. Or is there any opportunity for additional input or tweaking at this point?
So the study is complete, where our requirement was to have a completed study by September 1st, or the first business day after that. And so the study is complete. I think where comments can be helpful is if there is, if the commission takes us up on our suggestion to have a process on what an implementation plan might look like, what the costs might be, then we have opportunity to, in kind of estimating that, take into account other comments. Like, so we'll leave it at that.
Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, TJ, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen.
As you're doing that, I meant to thank you, Ben, and that this has been a challenging project, as you might imagine, and NV5 has been really good about taking comments and a lot of feedback and discussion on the comments. So thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Ben.
Likewise. And thanks to the TAG, as TJ mentioned, for the great input over the last few sessions, as well as all your time reviewing the work. It was very helpful, and as we'll see today, there's been some updates since we all last met. So can you hear me and see my screen okay before I move forward?
Yes, we can. Can I ask permission if there are clarifying questions as you go through this? Would you be willing to take those? Not comments, but just clarification so that there's understanding.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's fine with us. Maybe we can stop at a good stopping point in some sections for those, or do you want to take clarifying questions?
No, that would be helpful.
Okay.
If you have some.
Right. Okay, so we'll do that. Thank you. Well, yeah, thanks again. Agenda is kind of similar to what we all discussed this was last month when we all met. So I'll go through this pretty quick. We'll reintroduce the team for those of you that weren't around last time. A quick reminder of the project summary, kind of reiterating what TJ just explained to us. We'll have kind of a summary of what the major changes were from the draft results to the final results that we're reviewing today. We'll review some of the methodology to better frame the analysis and to give everybody a better insight into how the potential study worked and how some of the changes worked. We'll go through the maximum achievable results, which kind of help tee up the overall Act 18 optimized results. And we'll be reviewing emissions, costs, benefits, And then the breakout of emissions by type of measure in the sector. We'll look at cost effectiveness. We'll look at the top measures, which have changed since the last time we've met for residential, commercial, industrial, and the sector neutral fuels. We'll look at low and moderate income potential, and then wrap up with a conversation on workforce and some of the results that we've seen based on the optimization of the model and how that impacts workforce and the gaps there. And then a quick review of the estimates that we put in the final report around other sources of funding that are currently available. These weren't inputs into the model, but I think it helps as a frame of reference for other funding that's available to compare to some of the costs we're looking at today. So on the call, NV5, again, the overall project manager for the project. E3, who was also on the call, was supported the project from the emerging fuels subject matter expert perspective. On the call today, myself, overall project manager, and you'll hear from Matt Sachs, Cliff, and Griff also from NV5 are on the call today and who supported the modeling of this project. And from E3, Dr. Bill Weedle is also on the call to answer questions on emerging fuels, similar to the conversation we had last month. Quick summary, we've seen this before, and TJ kind of explained this. Again, clean heat standard intended to reduce emissions in the thermal sector through clean heat credits, which represent reduced emissions from clean heat measures. The clean heat measures are what's incorporated into the potential study today, and we'll be focusing on what the potential from those clean heat measures throughout the presentation. Overall project objective, and this is similar to potential studies in general, is to quantify the technically achievable and maximum achievable thermal resources, including a subset of economic potential for Vermont's thermal sector resources. And Matt will define again what technically achievable and maximum achievable mean. But ultimately, the potential study and these scenarios or achievable scenarios inform the price and amount of clean heat measures as TJ discussed. Ultimately, the final results we'll see at the end was to quantify what we're calling Act 18 optimized achievable scenarios to meet the GWSA requirements of Act 18. So some caveats to this study and potential studies in general, and Matt will go into more detail on these in a minute. But with any model or potential study, it's somewhat of a simplification of project cost variances, savings, and scope. With any model, there are uncertainties around adoption rates from the market, what the future technologies could be and the cost of those technologies, the availability of renewable fuels and biofuels, and overall how the market will respond to the above factors. So the model incorporated these to the best of our ability, including the good responses and information from the TAG. But just a caveat there in general. And again, a reminder that the potential scenarios in the final report and in the presentation are not an implementation plan, nor do the costs represent an implementation plan. The costs that Matt will be reviewing today represent more of an upper boundary edge case cost scenario to inform the clean heat standard. Again, uncertainty remains around how an implementation program will be implemented or function in the market, who will be the implementers rather, and how the market will respond to an implementation of a clean heat standard. So potential studies to inform, and it's not representative of implementation plan. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt Sachs and go start going through the high level changes since we last met.
All right, thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone on the call today. I'm going to go through a few slides here, outlining the major changes since the final draft results that we presented, I think back in late July. I'll also walk through a few slides covering some of the high level methodology. We've been through that in more detail in previous meetings, so the focus will be just a kind of a refresher on the overall approach, and then a focus on some key changes, particularly around how the Act 18 optimized scenario was conducted, given some of the changes I'll go through on this slide. So in a nutshell, and just to begin this is not an exhaustive list. In the process of ongoing QC, a lot of other measure inputs, more detailed measure inputs were changed and updated based on feedback. But these are the major drivers, I think, in some of the changes you'll see in the results relative to what have been shared previously. So first, the final results reflect updates to the Vermont greenhouse gas inventory and forecast, both the methods and the results of those change in methods. New in the 2021 version of the inventory was the retroactive removal of non-road emissions that were previously included in the RCI, or the thermal sector, which is the focus of our potential study. So that had the impact of lowering the emissions values for the RCI sector, in particular for certain key years that we're concerned with in the study, 1990 being one of them, because that is the baseline year for against which achievement of GWSA requirements is measured. But also a couple of other key years, 2018, which we'll see why that's important in the next bullet here. And also in projections of 2023 emissions, which was the, while not finalized in a inventory report, we have preliminary numbers for those, which were the starting point for our analysis. The second bullet here is that since the last results were published, we've used a new methodology for calculating the reduction targets that the RCI sector would be responsible for. Previously, we were assuming that all sectors in the inventory would need to hit the GWSA targets of 40% reduction by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Since then, we've gotten, and I think on the last call, we got input from the Vermont Climate Council that we should be shifting to a target estimation approach that reflects sectoral proportionality based on 2018. So what that means is the 1990 emissions inventory, that emissions value, when you apply the targets to it at the 2030 and 2050 years, that represents the total that must be reduced, economy-wide or statewide. But the portion of the target that the RCI sector should be responsible for is based on the proportion of emissions that the RCI sector is responsible for overall, based on the 2018 inventory. So that had a pretty substantial impact on the magnitude of the emissions reductions that RCI needed to hit. And I think you'll see that throughout the results today, particularly on the Act 18 optimized scenario. Lastly, a few updates to consideration of clean fuels and the associated assumptions. Based on consistent, in the previous results, we were using the life cycle emissions values for biofuels and renewable fuels when accounting towards achievement of the GWSA requirements. We've since revised that assumption and to make those emissions factors for GWSA accounting or greenhouse gas inventory accounting consistent with the current treatment of renewable natural gas, which is to assume that there's a zero emissions factor for those fuels in the RCI sector. We've also updated emissions factors for certain clean fuels pathways. Previously, we were using the 75th percentile from active projects in the California Air Resources Board's low carbon fuel standard project database. Based on some of the feedback on the previous results, we've shifted those to the median values, to reflect a closer reflection of the current state. And on that same vein, for certain clean fuels, we've doubled the assumed availability for those fuels, again, based on feedback and what current contracts represent for those fuels. We had previously been using a population weighted approach, assuming that resources would be shared among states in the region that was assumed to be where those fuels would be sourced from. Basically, they would be distributed based on a population weighted approach. We've shifted that to doubling the assumed availability for Vermont for certain clean fuel pathways in the initial years of the analysis. And then that transitions over time back to the population weighted values, assuming that there's going to be more competition for those resources in the future. So moving on to the methodology, again, I think it's helpful just to refresh our memories on the different scenarios that this analysis considered. So first, we started by conducting what we call the technical potential. And this is the full technical potential for all clean heat measures assessed without any consideration for competition among measures or interaction among measures if multiple measures are installed. So it's really just, if you installed these measures in isolation, what is the total technical potential for each individual opportunity without consideration for anything else? And we assume that's like a snapshot in time. If you could, wave that magic wand and make all of that happen instantaneously, what would that technical potential be without regard for any market barriers, be they cost barriers or otherwise? Next, we considered the maximum achievable potential. This is a scenario where we assume some idealized program designs and incentives that cover 100% of installed costs for the measures. This is considered an estimate for the entire portfolio of measures. So we have to consider mutual exclusivity and interactions in this scenario. From there, we move on to an Act 18 optimized or optimization scenario. And this is where we, using the maximum achievable potential as a starting point, adjusted or optimized the portfolio to meet Act 18 policy requirements. And I'll get it a little bit more into how that scenario was conducted on the next couple of slides. And then finally, we reported on the economic potential. Here we're essentially applying an economic screen to both the maximum achievable and the Act 18 optimized potential, basically identifying at the measure level which opportunities pass the Vermont societal cost test. This is just a reporting screen. We're not removing any measures from the analysis explicitly because of their either passing or failing the Vermont societal cost test, but it's more for informational purposes. Next slide, please. Here's a quick overview of the entire modeling process. I'll move through this fairly quickly. we started out with characterizing individual clean heat measures, their key parameters, costs, savings, lifetimes. We then moved on to defining the applicable market for each of those measures. You obviously can't install every measure in every building. Depends on what the existing equipment is and what the existing efficiency of that equipment is. Then we moved on to estimating the technical potential. That's where we apply those applicability factors to estimate that kind of silo at the measure level technical potential. Once we introduce interactions and mutual exclusivity and actual market barriers through the application of adoption curves, we ended up with the maximum achievable potential, which we optimized as discussed to develop that Act 18 optimized scenario. And then finally applied that cost effectiveness screen to segment the max achievable and the Act 18 optimized potential into cost effective and cost ineffective potential. Next slide. In the final results here, our approach to the Act 18 optimized scenario changed considerably from the previous results. Primarily driven by that change to both the methodology for the inventory and the adoption of a sector proportionality based approach. It basically led to the targets being considerably below what was identified in the maximum achievable potential versus in the previous results. They were actually higher than the maximum achievable potential in some years. So to deal with this change and recognizing, I guess, first that the maximum achievable scenario assumes very aggressive adoption curves. It's basically as it sounds like it's intended to be the maximum you could do. If we were to take those curves as a starting point for the optimized potential, that would considerably front load achievement, exacerbate any workforce constraints, and looking down the road a bit, lead to highly variable program budgets over the analysis period. To deal with this, we converted the adoption rates from the max achievable scenario to constant annual values, basically dividing the cumulative adoption over the number of years in the analysis period. Also, the nuance here is that we wanted to limit that incremental annual adoption to the max achievable adoption curves in the corresponding years. So we're never saying that an average annual rate could exceed the corresponding incremental annual adoption in the maximum achievable scenario. It's a way to kind of meter that consumption. So we're not considering you can do a more aggressive ramp in the optimized scenario. Another key piece here is that, per Act 18 requirements to prioritize low income and moderate income, we assume that all LMI energy efficiency and fuel switching measures were adopted in this scenario. Next, we ranked, and this is where the cost optimization comes in. We ranked each measure in order of measure cost per ton of lifetime life cycle emissions reductions, and remove the most expensive measures from the portfolio, basically riding the supply curve down until the reductions matched the 2050 GWSA targets in 2049. And just one note here, throughout this presentation, we interpret the 2050 goal as really being a 2049 goal because it needs to be achieved on January 1. So if we throw around 2049, that's why it's at the end of 2049, we're assuming you need to hit the 2050 targets. Next, because we only have two interim goals, a 2030 target and a 2050 target, and we didn't want to vastly overshoot what you needed to do in any given year, we used the 2023 historical emissions and the 2030 GWSA targets and linearly interpolated what the maximum allowable emissions would be for the RCI sector in each year. And then likewise for the 2030 to 2049 period, used the goals, the 2030 and the 2050 goals to set what the maximum allowable emissions were. And then the final step here was with those, annual, interpolated goals. We reduced the clean fuels adoption values downward in each year, starting with the most expensive pathway until we just met those interpolated goals in each year. So the end result of this is that you have the right mix of resources in 2050 to meet the 2050 targets. And all of the non-clean fuel measures are installed kind of gradually over time at a reasonable install rate. Next slide, please. And I think I'll pause there if there are any questions on that before we move into the final results.
I'll jump in with a question. This is Emily. Can you just remind me how you treated incremental versus full cost for installed measures?
Sure. So the vast majority of the measures in the portfolio, I guess the equipment-based measures are assumed to be retrofits, time discretionary retrofits, whether it be weatherization or electrification with heat pumps. In which case the incremental cost is the installed cost. So as far as, if you see treatment of, or discussion of incentives here, in all cases, we're assuming that the incentives cover 100% of the installed costs. But as we look to, applying the Vermont Societal Cost Test, when we get to those results, those do include the impacts of a deferred replacement credit, which would kind of capture some of the effects of, kind of an incremental cost, if you will, reflecting the fact that, you're avoiding some future equipment purchase, even though we didn't include that impact for the calculation of the installed costs and the associated incentive coverage.
Thank you.
Sure.
Matt, you had have your hand up.
So Matt, you had a question?
Yeah. So it says a couple of different things. Thank you for this report. Enjoy reading it very much. Regarding installed measures, there is a couple different assumptions, and I wonder if you could help clarify. The way I look at installed measures as they're defined, it could be replacing the entire heating load, or, as certainly we know in the field, it could be replacing some of the heating load that comes from fossil. But it's some of the, and this is maybe my semantic problem, but it's kind of muddied a little bit in that in the report it talks about, like specifically on page 10, it makes some sort of assumption that you install electric heating equipment, and that the existing or the historical furnace or boiler will in fact be removed, when that's not common practice at all, at least not in Vermont. It can replace most or some, depending on the building shell and depending on the size of the building and depending on the number of heat pumps that go in. But generally speaking, no heating contractor, and I work for almost all of them, will remove a piece of equipment in existing structure, even though a supplemental heating system, whether it's a modern wood stove or a heat pump, goes in. Very extreme examples. So how do you square that circle? Because I'm trying to figure out how you would account for this issue.
Well, the study did include partial displacement measures that were not full replacements. So if you look at some of the workbook data, if you run down the measure list, I mean, there are measures in there that are assumed to be partial displacements where those existing systems are not removed. I mean, it's just an assumption for any full replacement in this study that there is no conventional heating system anymore. But there are those partial displacements represented, where the full heating load is not displaced.
Thanks.
How do you break out the percentage though between those that where a heating equipment, whether it's a modern wood stove or electric heating equipment is installed, and how do you determine which ones are complete replacements, which ones are partial? They're partial. How much of that load is that broken out? Is that there that much granularity that I just didn't that I missed for some reason?
I mean, you could derive that breakout from the data in the workbooks. Those measures that are defined as partials, should be clearly denoted. So you could make that breakout. I think in general, this analysis tends to favor assuming that full displacements or full replacements are pursued, just because you need to hit a pretty aggressive target by 2050. And if you only pursue partials, you're unlikely to get there. And certainly when you start to introduce the requirements that low income and moderate income homes need to have at least half of their credits generated by capital measures or measures that reduce their bills, I think it tips the scale towards needing to pursue full replacements.
Thanks. I think we need to probably keep moving since there's no other questions right now.
Sure. So starting out here, again, we're kind of bypassing technical potential. While it's important as a kind of a stepping stone to get to the other scenarios, I think we're gonna spend most of our time talking about the max achievable and the optimized potential today. So max achievable, I just have a couple of slides on this. This doesn't look drastically different than the previous results, except probably for the different targets. So this figure here shows the estimated RCI emissions by year in thousands of metric tons CO2e. So we see it starts out in 1990, our baseline year, and then jumps to 2023, which is our starting year for calculating what the reductions are relative to. And then in each year, 26 through the end of the analysis period, we're showing what the impact of the modeled portfolio of clean heat potential will mean for the resulting emissions in the RCI sector. So the max achievable now blows past the 2030 target. Here shown in 2029. It saves. Sorry, there's a typo in this slide, but 1.2 million metric tons in 2029, that should be, and then 1.9 million metric tons in 2049. Both of those values far exceed both the 2030 and the 2050 target. I also point out here that the net RCI emissions, what the net means here is that denotes that we've included the impacts of any increased electric consumption sector emissions. But those are actually fairly low, given that the emissions factors for electricity drop considerably over the first few years of the analysis period. And then we have I guess relatively compared to biofuels and renewable fuels, a slower ramp on fuel switching measure adoption. And just to point out, I think as we did last time, the 2030 values or 2023 emissions relative to the 1990 emissions kind of undercut, because they increase between those years, kind of undercuts the achievement toward the 2030 goal, but that impact's greatly reduced from the emissions numbers we were starting with in the draft results. Next slide, please. Just a quick summary of the overall societal net benefits and the max achievable potential. We modeled total societal net benefits of $1 billion in this scenario. Just a reminder here, net, what would be by net benefits in this context is the total societal benefits less the total societal costs. And per the Vermont societal cost tests, benefits include any avoided energy or fuel costs, capacity costs, and T&D costs, any additional resource savings, externalities, so social cost of carbon, and any non-energy benefits. Costs here include measure costs, again, less deferred equipment replacement costs, if there are any, and there are a lot, given that a lot of these measures are models as retrofits, and any increased electric or fuel consumption, the cost associated with those. So next slide, please. This is, providing a summary of those societal benefits and costs, looking through two different time periods. The first set of columns, I guess columns 2 through 5 here, are looking through at the cumulative costs and benefits for measures installed through 2029, and then the second set is all inclusive of all measures installed through 2049. I think the key things I'd point out here are that through 2049, as we reported on that last slide, in the present value societal net benefits column here, there's $1.0 billion in net societal benefits. And one other thing I'd call attention to here is that's without assuming any program non-incentive costs. The study also included a very high level estimate of what the non-incentive costs for a program implementing clean heat measures could look like. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty there, and we speak to this in the report around what supporting activities would be required to support the installation of such measures. But at a high level, we applied a 3% multiplier to the incentive costs for clean fuels measures, and a 15% multiplier to the incentives for the non-clean fuels measures, or the efficiency and fuel switching measures, to provide some estimate of those non-incentive costs. When those values are included, the net societal benefits go negative here by $500 million over the full analysis period. Next slide.
Lloyd, do you have a quick clarifying question you want to on that?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was unmuted when I was clearing my throat. But real quick clarification question: the net societal benefits, can you remind me, does that include just the social cost of carbon and fuel costs and savings, or does it also include net societal benefits of public health benefits from cleaner air, co-pollutants, things like that?
The only other benefits category was the inclusion of the 15% non-energy benefits adder, and that's applied to costs and benefits for energy resources. So it cuts both ways, depending on the resource. So because I think the guidance is that it's applied to the net present value of energy cost savings, as well as any penalties from increased consumption. But there were no additional health non-energy benefits included.
Rick, you have a quick question?
Yeah, thank you. Clarifying question. I know we've been through this before, and I read the report. Sector neutral, that's all clean fuels, and
That's all, yes.
And residential, commercial, and industrial are installed measures. Is that essentially the way to think about this?
Correct.
That's what I thought. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Matt, I don't want to rush you too much because all this is very important, but we probably have 15 or 20 minutes before there's conversation.
Okay, I'll move through this quickly. So I guess given that, let's well, I'll speak to this slide, and then maybe we can skip a couple here. In the max achievable, I think similar to what we saw before, the potential is dominated in the early years by clean fuels. That transitions slowly to fuel switching measures over time. As those measures displace the need for conventional fuels and then clean fuels as well. By the end of the analysis period, 71% of the cumulative emissions reductions are from fuel switching measures. Next slide, please. So moving on into the Act 18 optimized scenario, a couple of things to point out. This is the same sort of figure as we presented for max achievable. You'll note that the achievement, it looks much more linear, again, because we were calibrating to an interpolated goal. We have one slope between 2023 and 2029, and then another slope between 2029 and 2049. In both 2029 and 2049, we're just meeting the 2030 and 2050 targets respectively by design because of our calibration approach. So those 0.7 million metric tons that we reduce in 2029 and the 1.7, those are squared with the requirements using that sector proportionality approach for the goals in the RCI sector. So let's move forward, Ben, please. Again, looking at the societal net benefits under the optimized scenario, considerably higher than the max achievable scenario because of our cost optimization approach. So in this case, this portfolio would yield $3 billion in net benefits over the full analysis period. Next slide. Again, in the interest of time, I'll probably go through this quickly, but to point out here, I think in the cumulative through 2049 set of columns here, the societal net benefits, as I mentioned, that 3 billion number corresponds to the second to last row. That's the total without the non-incentive costs. When we add those on, in contrast to the max achievable scenario, we're still cost effective with positive societal net benefits here, generating $2.1 billion in net benefits. Next slide. A little insight into what's where these benefits and costs are coming from. This kind of stacked column chart here breaks down like the key contributors to the costs and benefits. I just note that just to simplify the presentation here, even though some of these categories have both costs and benefits associated with them, they've been combined into individual like net benefits or net costs contributors, just to make this a little easier to digest. But the things to point out that the largest category of benefits is avoided social, economic, and environmental damages. So that's inclusive of social cost of carbon, as well as avoided NOx and I think it's just NOx actually. And the second highest is avoided fuel oil and propane consumption, the avoided costs associated with those. And on the cost side, the incremental measure costs are the highest cost of the component of the costs, followed by biofuels and renewable fuels consumption. Next slide, please. This figure shows the estimated incentive budgets over time by measure type. Again, stressing that this is not intended to reflect a program or implementation plan. There are certainly ways to reduce incentives relative to installed costs that the study didn't assess. But the key here is to point out that with the more linearized approach to achieving the targets over time, we end up with a much flatter incentive budget over time than in the previous results. Also, interesting to point out that it kind of looks that the fuel switching is the bulk of the incentive spend, but it's important to note that, for every dollar you spend on clean fuels, that's only has a measured life of 1 year. So you only get your emissions reductions for 1 year, versus, some of the fuel switching and energy efficiency measures, they can have lifetimes of, 15 to 20 years. So, while it looks like it's way more expensive to pursue fuel switching, just in terms of how the distribution of the measures shakes out in the portfolio, it's important to note that these are contributing different levels of lifetime savings.
And Matt, this chart, just to confirm, is 100% incentive levels, like it's paying for the full freight of the program would theoretically pay for the full freight.
Correct.
Thank you.
So Brian, you've had your hand up. I'm not sure. I don't have the full view of the slides. Is this an appropriate place to stop? Would you like to hold that question, Matt?
No, this is good. Just, we all heard loud and clear TJ say these are not implementation costs. And I understand that. But when I'm looking at particularly these Act 18 optimized costs, and particularly I think on the table on slide 15, it's like, what's the best way to interpret them? Like, we heard what they're not, but like, besides what you said, that these would inform an analysis of what an implementation cost would actually be, or, immediate consumption, what besides the EV ratio that we're looking at, is there any other thing that I'm supposed to be taking away from these numbers? And if you want to save it to the end, that's fine. If it's a complicated answer or relates to other things you're going to talk about.
Maybe we should save it for the end just to make sure we get through the rest of the content.
That's fine.
But yeah, thanks for the comment. And I can move through this quickly. In the optimized scenario, similar to what we saw in the max achievable, clean fuels is able to ramp up much more quickly, and plays a very large part in satisfying the 2029 targets. But as we incorporate energy efficiency and fuel switching measures more gradually over time, those are contributing, the vast majority of the emissions reductions, or the cumulative reductions, by the end of the study period. Next slide. Just real quickly here, kind of consistent with the emissions inventory itself in terms of the distribution of emissions across sectors. Here we see like what the reductions are by sector. Residential is the highest, followed by commercial, and then that little blue section of the graph here is for industrial. Again, pretty consistent with the distribution in the inventory. And then, as was pointed out earlier, that sector neutral is for clean fuels. But as we talked about last time, a lot of that might be going to industrial in practice, because of the hard to electrify end uses there, like industrial process heating, for instance. Next slide. On the cost effectiveness side, this is showing the results of that Vermont SCT screen on the results. I think the key thing to look at here is the uneconomic fuel switching, that kind of hashed blue section of the graph here. It shows that there's a considerable amount of the potential out in 2049 that is represented by measures that fail the cost effectiveness test. A lot of that is as a result of forcing low income and moderate income measures into the portfolio. But I think it's an important thing to note. But overall, 62% of the potential is cost effective in 2049.
Yeah, could you
Can I
hold
just
your question, Emily, till we get to a pause and we'll take
It's
your.
it's just a super quick clarifying question.
Sure.
Is that uneconomic based on factoring in I forget what you called it, but like the natural replacement, like this is still, you were talking about like.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The Vermont Societal Cost Test, it considers the impacts of the deferred replacement credits. So it's still those measures are still failing with the inclusion of that credit.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide. We've got a few slides here on the top measures. I think in the interest of time, I might skip over these and we can come back if there are questions and get to this slide on low income. As we talked about last time, Act 18 requires that basically that 16% of the credits need to be generated in at low income customers and an additional 16% from low or moderate income customers. This graph here shows basically where low income, which is represented by the blue line, and moderate income by the orange line, are getting relative to those metrics. So we see moderate income is exceeding that target in every year, but as we saw in the draft results, low income is still falling short of that. I think this is an important thing to call out here is, even when we're essentially assuming that all of the low income and moderate income equipment-based fuel switching measures and energy efficiency measures are adopted, or at least those measures that were considered in this analysis, we're still not hitting that 16% requirement. So, I think it's probably worth, checking that the whatever data was used to inform those targets, kind of lines up with, what is possible, in the building stock, in terms of where those emissions are coming from. Because I think that what this indicates is there might be some, misalignment between those requirements and what what is feasible. You could oversample, if you will, low income and moderate income, but given that the targets through 2049 are pretty deep, you have to go deep everywhere essentially, which means that you might be able to hit those targets in some years. Maybe you spread this out a little differently and try to hit that 16% in some years, but hitting them consistently over the entire analysis period, I think would certainly be a challenge. Next slide. Okay, with that, I'll turn it back over to Ben to walk through some of the workforce findings.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So I'll summarize the workforce and the existing funding slides, and then we can get back to questions. Brian, we can go back to yours when we wrap these up first. So the first thing that we wanted to look at regarding workforce for this study is kind of the existing landscape or near-term historical landscape of workforce, specifically for clean energy in Vermont. There's more detail here in the final report, but some interesting takeaways that we found. 6% of all jobs in Vermont are in the clean energy industry somewhere. It's interesting to note that half of those workers of that workforce are in the installation, maintenance, and repair field. A lot of these would be installation, maintenance, and repair of the clean heat measures we're talking about. So there is a substantial part of the overall clean energy workforce in that install, maintenance, and repair sector of the overall workforce. Another interesting thing to note, difficulty in hiring has been a consistent theme in the research that we found in Vermont, but this is also consistent across the United States and the workforce. And you can see here, around 2020 through 2023, and this was in the Vermont Clean Energy Industry Report from 2023, is a substantial increase in what that report and what survey respondents declared as difficulty in hiring in clean energy workforce, specifically HVAC trades. So you can see in 2020, 34% of the respondents declared they've had difficulty in hiring some positions, and that increased substantially over that 4-year time period. So, I think it's important as we get further into the workforce and in the final report, the importance of workforce development programs and funding is a pretty big point to help, create a labor force that has skill sets and the appropriate skill sets to do this type of work, which we'll talk about in a second. I did see the Department of Energy just released a clean energy industry update that shows a decline in difficulty in hiring. So I think these trends are going down. We haven't seen 2024 numbers. What we're seeing here is representative of Vermont, but from what we're seeing is as we get further and there's more funding available, that difficulty in hiring for these positions isn't as bad as it has been. The other takeaway here is that, since half the jobs are kind of in that installation, maintenance, and repair field, the skill positions and installation positions were most of the positions that were deemed difficult to hire. And again, the takeaway that's specific to some of the measures we have in the potential study is that installation and we'll see weatherization workforce, those types of roles were the most difficult to hire. And there's more information in the final report and dependencies that go into more detail on those. The second thing, and this was to kind of frame the near-term historical workforce trends with what needs and could be done in the future to support the gaps in workforce that we found in the optimized results, is a review of existing workforce training organizations. Throughout Vermont, there's a lot of organizations that provide continuing education or workforce opportunities for the HVAC trades. There's a list and description in the final report, and we interviewed a lot of these organizations as well. They, are focused on, and this is based on market need and also based on HVAC company demand on heat pumps and weatherization mainly. So the workforce training that is being provided in Vermont does align with the measures and types of equipment that we're seeing in the potential study and that are most in demand as well. So the organizations that we talk to are really listening to the market and listening to the HVAC companies about the types of positions they need to hire for and pivoting their workforce training programs to align with those needs. When we talk to these training organizations, and the resource and the Vermont Adult Learning come to mind here, and probably as we all thought, is funding is a major barrier to increasing the cohorts of students in these workforce development programs. Some of the feedback we received is, first year funding for workforce development programs are substantial, but it was reported that it is difficult to get additional funding year after year, right? It's a nice PR visibility to say we've, wherever the funding came from, that we funded a workforce program, but it's been hard to get that second, third, and fourth year of funding to maintain and increase the cohorts of students. So that lack of support to maintain these workforce programs is a big barrier. and also, spreading out regionally the workforce programs for heat pump and weatherization installation it's been difficult for these organizations in rural areas. There is a need, they're finding the demand out there, but to get enough students and to make it cost effective for them to do a 2-3 person workforce training program in a rural area has been difficult. The benefits of these workforce outside of providing opportunities for people transitioning careers or wouldn't have opportunities in other workforce areas is there has been really good feedback and a feedback loop from the HVAC trades that the workforce development programs are providing a good set of skills for weatherization and heat pump installers, and that the HVAC companies are really using these workforce development programs as kind of a pre-vetting of employees. And they are reporting that when they're hiring people outside of or after the workforce development programs, that they do have the appropriate skill sets. And a lot of these workforce organizations have relationships with HVAC trades.
So Ben, I'm hoping we can save the last 5 minutes, which running up to the public comment period for just any questions. Can we, is there any real important highlights you want to get out there before we turn immediately to those questions?
Yep. So real quick on the optimized results. So this is where the gap analysis is conducted, and there's more information in detail in the final report as well as appendices here. The big takeaway when we're looking at the optimized results for some of the high impact measures is that for weatherization, when you compare where the existing workforce is today, these number of workers represent a 1 FTE employee. The number of current workers today to where they need to be optimized in these 2030 and 2049 periods is we're showing a 4x need or 4x increase in need for workforce development, mainly in weatherization. This is where the big gap is. And this also aligns with some of the reports we've seen in Vermont as well. So, there's a discussion in the final report on this. But the takeaway is there is a gap that exists between existing and optimized workforce needed, specifically in weatherization, and further, supports the need for funding based on some of those organizational barriers that I talked about as well to get us there. And there's a description of some of the funding that's been done in other states and some of the increases in workforce that has happened in the report as well. But that was the takeaway on this one.
So we have Brian's outstanding question, and I wanted to make sure if other people might have had questions, they have an opportunity to get them answered. Brian, you had asked about how to interpret the costs that were in slide 15. Matt, you want to take that one?
Sure, I can. Yeah, Ben, you want to go back to slide 15? Yeah, so one thing I just wanted to make sure is perfectly clear. I don't want to conflate the you can call it the incentive cost budgets that were presented in the slides in the Act 18 optimized potential with these values, these societal costs and societal benefits. Because of how the Vermont societal cost test is structured, I mean, there's a lot of, I guess, confounding impacts in any of these, the treatment of specific benefits and costs, in terms of some of the fuel savings being counted as, negative costs or, increases being treated as negative benefits. So I think like hearing the core of your question, what do we do with these cost numbers? I think the societal cost and benefit screening kind of is what it is. It's what passes the Vermont societal cost test, which is the metric that's used to determine what's cost effective from a societal perspective in Vermont. The incentive, the figure on incentive budgets, I think that you can kind of treat that as an upper boundary of, what you would need, potentially what a program would potentially need to pay to achieve the GWSA targets. And that's, again, an upper boundary. It assumes incentives cover 100% of installed costs. So there's considerable room below that to develop incentive structures, specific program designs that target subsegments that might be more inclined to do more with less financial incentives to come down from those values. But what we really have is an estimate of the incremental measure costs and incentives associated with those that it would potentially take to hit the targets. And we've got all of the individual measure data to see what the various measures could contribute. So it's kind of the building blocks of how you might put together a portfolio that gets to the targets.
Thanks. We had 2 more questions, Matt and then Ken.
Yeah, one quick point for what it's worth, which is it seems to be you're tying a lot of the modeling to the price of renewable fuel sold in California. And I understand some of the reasoning for that, but they are different markets, different supply chains, and I just put a caution to tying too much of that modeling off that. But then the other question I have is putting on my role as equity advisory group and having to, provide some context for this. How would you explain, or how should I explain, the ability or the challenge with meeting that 16% low income credit requirement? Can you explain a little bit more in depth about why we're falling short there on this model and why, and maybe how to fix that?
Sure. And I think, and we could go back and confirm that this is the driver, but in researching that question, I think a lot of it comes down to, where the emissions in the RCI sector are coming from. And I think in our modeling, low income and moderate income represent less than a combined 32% of the overall RCI emissions. So that means you would need to, do more in low income and moderate income than they represent proportional to the total inventory. And as you go, deeper towards the reduction targets, you have to do a lot in all sectors. And I think just because of that, that issue around the, where the emissions are coming from, that makes those numbers difficult to hit. I wouldn't be surprised to see a 16% of residential emissions be a target, for low income, and 16% for moderate income of residential, but 16% of total emissions, inclusive of commercial and industrial. I think it's higher than what those, at least as far as our modeling is concerned, higher than what those subsectors represent in terms of the total source of emissions.
Got it. So there's no there. There's no, if you did everything you possibly could do, you still couldn't get to that because there's not enough emissions from that one narrow slice in order to. I see. Okay,
right. And you couldn't do it. You couldn't do it every year, I should say. I mean, you could, just very, very much front load it and hit those numbers in your first 3, 4 years, 5 years of implementation. But sustaining that, you're going to run out.
Okay. All right, we have 3 hands, Ken, Emily, and Floyd. And just to note that I am going to have to cut it off in 5 more minutes so that we have time for public comment. So quick answers.
Just want to give kind of the general observation here. I appreciate this work. It represents one approach, And I know all of us would probably tweak this, tweak that, more of these, less of that. We're not going to go there. We don't have the time to do that. So I appreciate this. But there is one observation that I think is important for us as a tag to recognize, and that is you start in 2026. And it's a challenge of this law that installations starting in 2023 count. And so your curves that extrapolate to zero at 2025 aren't. We have installed measures in 23, 24, and 25, so that the installed measures part isn't quite that shape. And there's an implication to that as well. And it's related to the non-economic choices or the non-economic installations. It is probable, because I know I am one, that in that 23 to 25 period, accomplish non-economic installations. I'm never going to make money on what I did, even if I include the social cost of carbon. And understanding that is going to be really important for us. So, as this product is going to be reviewed by a lot of people, and that whole thing of non-economic does not mean irrational. And I just want all of us, and you folks can react to it, but I just want all of us to be aware of that, because I say I don't consider myself irrational, and yet I put in a heat pump that would never pass an economic benefit test. Thanks.
So you're Emily.
Yeah, I wanted to just I guess a couple similar things that I think the tag should be thinking about that kind of are illuminated by this work. As I mentioned previously, and it may be okay, but there are very different assumptions for some biofuels in this analysis than in the draft opinion dynamics. Carbon intensities. So I just wanted to note that as something we can kind of think about as we move forward. And one specific thing that I guess does lead to a question for me is the way that NV5 modeled renewable fuels or biofuels kind of falling out because of the carbon intensity requirements that they have to be below 60% in 2030 and 20% in 2050. And I would just flag for the tag that the tag has remained to date agnostic about whether that should be like what should happen after 2030, like if that should be a gradual decline from 60% to 20% every year, or if it should just be like 60% and then it pops down to 20% in 2050. And that actually has pretty big implications for certain renewable fuels, biofuels kind of falling out of the mix in that time period. So things like wastewater biomethane, some kinds of renewable diesels and biodiesels might fall out if you did a more gradual decline, whereas they would stay in the mix through 2050 if you just kept everything at 60% until you stepped all the way down to 20% after 2049. I don't know if people are following this, but I think that's an important thing that we will need to kind of take a look at. And I guess for NV5, I was curious, do you have any sense of how much the results would have shifted because NV5 assumed a step down, like it's all at 60% and then goes all the way down to 20%. And I just wonder like the implications for some of the results and the role of biofuels in the later years if that was a more general decline.
I would want to check the numbers, but in the previous results, I mean, we didn't see even the 2050 requirement as eliminating a huge amount of the technical resource. It certainly impacted some pathways, but I think the highest contributors were still eligible even down to the 20% relative to fuel oil carbon intensity requirement. So I don't think that would greatly change the results, but I would want to confirm before I with the numbers before I say that with certainty. And I don't know, and Bill is on the call. If we looked at if there were more granularities to pathways or the, you know, versus the way things were modeled, that might begin to eliminate some of the resource that might have been aggregated. I'm not sure. But at the level that things were modeled, I don't see it as having a huge impact on the available resource.
Okay, thank you.
Minute we have left, though, can I get Floyd's question in before we continue? It's because we do have to move to public comment. We really don't have a
Yeah,
choice.
so real quick, my understanding is, and this is building on a point that Matt made earlier. My understanding is the standardized regulatory impacts assessment for the 2023 low carbon fuel standard rulemaking was relied on as part of the cost modeling. I guess if that's true, I guess my word of caution on that, the current rulemaking that hasn't been completed yet in the LCFS is targeting very steep carbon intensity reductions, 90% by 2045. It's a transportation sector measure. So there are some significant caveats in terms of the ability to apply that sort of analysis and cost projections to this type of program. So just want to make sure folks understand that that's not a, there are some challenges to applying that in this application.
Thanks. We have 5 minutes, but if we go over, I'm hoping that the members can hang on an extra 5 minutes for the remainder of the public comments. We have several people that have already raised their hands, and I want to make sure that Pike, Jared.
Whoa, wait a minute, wait, before we go to public comment. I want to thank NV5 and the department for this presentation and taking our questions. The tag will ruminate on all this, and if we have more to say or think about it, and we'll let you know. But thank you very much, Ben, Matt, TJ. Really appreciate it.
And just if you'll hang tight, because they may have some questions for you, as the public may have some questions for you as well. So Pike, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I do have a question for NV5. Well, several questions. One is regarding the inclusion of the McNeil information. I'm wondering who asked you to do that, if you did it on your own, if there was someone who pushed you to include that. As I sent to some of you last night, that first environment report that NV5 cites doesn't include the actual emissions from the burning of wood at McNeil. So it's off by many thousands of tons when you include the actual emissions from carbon from wood combustion. That district energy system will increase carbon by close to 8,000 tons a year. The NV5 study, they say it's an analysis of McNeil. All it seems to be really is a summary of that first environment report. That first environment report does not include the ongoing costs of at least $665,000 a year, which would increase this project by $17 million over the 25-year lifetime. So the $42 million price tag that NV5 cites is inaccurate. But yeah, the question again is, who asked you to include this? More generally, the carbon emissions factors, the carbon intensity values of 0 or 0.3 for wood are inaccurate. Climate scientists have told us that the subsequent removal of carbon by carbon sequestration of tree growth does not help the atmospheric warming that the original combustion of trees has created. So we need to understand what clear climate science says, and we need to give wood combustion its full carbon intensity value as identified in the EPA carbon intensity value hub. And I know I'm mincing words here, but I think you get my point. I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Did you have a response about the McNeil study? I think that was the only question.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. Yeah, we included the information on the McNeil study. It was intended to be a reporting a secondary analysis, not original work by any means. We recognize that district systems were included in the list of eligible clean heat measures. So wanted to include some perspective on those systems. The McNeil one being, I think, furthest along, was included as intended again to be a point of comparison with what was modeled in the study. To the point about the omission of stack emissions, that was not the intent. We'll have to go back and look at the numbers again ourselves, because the life cycle emissions values that are presented for comparison and what was done elsewhere in the study, I think for consistency we would want to include those. So I can't confirm what that would change on the call here today, but we can take another look at that and make sure, because that omission wasn't intentional, if it was the case.
And was this your own initiative to include it, or was it at a request of some other party?
I mean, we had sole authority over the what was in the report.
Yeah, that's correct, Matt. Thank you for that. But I do want to just say we had a lot of comments come through that, hey, in July, there was no discussion of current programs and what would happen with current programs, as a part of the solution going forward. And to be responsive to those comments, we asked NV5 to say, hey, we have current programs. Can you talk about these in the report, and talk about different things that would be eligible for clean heat credits? And as Matt said, clean district energy is listed and is an eligible measure. And so and just to be clear, there was nothing beyond that in terms of the numbers related to district energy that was directed by the department.
Thanks for the clarification, TJ. Jared.
Thanks, Catherine. First, I just want to thank the Public Service Department and NV5 for the opportunity to comment both originally and now, and just really appreciate the work that you've all done on this. It's a very complex task on a very tight time frame, very large lift, and just appreciate the opportunity to engage with you on it. I have one quick clarifying question, and then I wanted to offer a comment, an observation. The question is, what is the assumption? I may have missed it in the draft, but I didn't see explicitly what the assumption is in terms of heating degree days. I mean, we've seen data that Vermont's winters are warming, decreasing heating degree days and the overall heating load or heating demand. It looked to me like you're just kind of starting with the 2023 as a baseline and projecting it forward. Did you make any assumptions around future winter temperatures or heating load or heating degree days out to the, in future decades, or not?
We did not. You're correct. The preliminary numbers for the 2023 inventory are the starting point. That's assumed for the entire analysis period in terms of what heating degree days and cooling degree days that represented.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. And I just wanted to, as a comment, and Matt or anybody from NV5, please feel free to interrupt me at any point if I state an assumption wrong or incorrectly. But I wanted to go back to the question that Emily asked around, in terms of the incentive costs, which I understood you presented them as an upper bound. But when we're looking at program costs or societal costs, incorporating 100% of the incentive, it sounds to me like, Emily's original question is, are you modeling incremental costs or full costs? It sounded to me like the answer is full cost because of the assumption around these being discretionary retrofits. And I think that there's just some important nuance there. I think it makes a lot of sense to model weatherization as a discretionary retrofit. I think it makes sense to model a partial fuel displacement, like a air source single head heat pump as a partial, as a discretionary retrofit. But there's a lot of these changes in installed measures and equipment that happen as a matter of course that are not discretionary. We estimate that based on Vermont's housing stock and existing equipment and the average lifespans of that equipment in the TRM, that about 10,000 to 15,000 Vermont households replace their space heating systems every year, and about 20 to 25,000 replace their water heaters every year. And so in an instance where a fossil water heater dies and somebody has to replace that, it's odd to me to assume, and maybe this comes out in the wash if the analysis is a societal cost test, because there is a cost, it's just where it's accounted for, either private or public dollars. But the idea that every piece of heating equipment that comes to the end of its life has to then be a public cost with 100% incentive strikes me as not appropriate. It is, I'm sure it's appropriate in some cases, covering 100% of the cost for weatherization for low-income homes. But for market rate weatherization, for market rate heat pump or water heater replacements, for market rate space heating, I don't think that every residence, every business in the state assumes that every new piece of equipment from now until 2050 is going to be fully paid for by public money. It seems more appropriate to me to look at the covering the incremental difference, or perhaps even a little bit higher than that, to motivate clean heat purchases. But moving the comparison here, it's kind of like we're lacking insight into what the business is, or the matter of course costs would be of all of that fossil equipment coming to the end of its life. And we're saying it has to become a program cost or an incentive cost rather than what would happen in the alternate scenario. So I just think that there's some important nuance there. It sounds like the place to have this conversation is in the more detailed and comprehensive economic analysis that the PUC will now presumably undertake if they follow your recommendations, including incorporating this report. But I just want to raise that because I think it's a really important question about how to model incentive costs, given that so many of these units are coming to the end of their life and have to be replaced anyway. And that would be the case with or without this program.
Thanks, Jared. I'm going to ask you to hold any response if you have one, so we can hear the other public comments first. So I think Laura Haight, you were up next.
Yes, thank you. My name is Laura Haight. I'm the U.S. Policy Director for the Partnership for Policy Integrity. Thank you for this opportunity to comment. We're going to be reviewing the opinion dynamics emissions analysis and submitting our questions and comments in writing to the PUC and the TAG. Our biggest question there is how they arrived at their draft life cycle emissions estimates for wood fuels. Clearly, their assumptions are flawed, as evidenced by the fact that their draft emissions rate for burning wood chips is lower than the grid emission rate. The average biomass power plant, like the McNeil biomass plant in Burlington, emits about a ton of CO2 for every ton of wood chips burned. It's well documented that stack emissions of CO2 from wood combustion exceed fossil fuel emissions. Average biomass power plants emit roughly 50% more CO2 per megawatt hour than a coal plant, and 2 to 3 times more CO2 per megawatt than a natural gas plant. So these emissions from the actual combustion of the biomass fuels must be accounted for any legitimate life cycle analysis. And both the EPA and the IPCC have stated that burning wood for energy is not categorically carbon neutral. Scientific studies have repeatedly shown that it can take decades to over a century of new forest growth for net emissions from biomass energy just to achieve parity with fossil fuel emissions, depending on a range of factors, including the fossil fuel being replaced, the source of the wood fuels, and the efficiency with which they are burned. So of course, we're going to be urging the TAG to insist that opinion dynamics develop scientifically sound emissions factors for wood fuels in the Vermont Clean Heat Standard. This is to ensure that ratepayer resources are directed to technologies and fuel sources that will actually reduce carbon emissions in the building sector. With regard to the NV5 report, that also includes a flawed accounting of the emissions impacts of the proposed McNeil District Energy Project. Be happy to share, our emissions projections for that facility. And once the opinion dynamics emissions factors are corrected and finalized, I would encourage that the NV5 report be amended to utilize the same metrics as the OD report so that policymakers have a better understanding of the program's potential program's potential carbon reductions. I do have a question. I can wait till the end as well on the NV5 report, which I did not read this section as carefully as I should have. With regard to the health impacts of the Affordable Heating Act, as you all know, PM 2.5 emissions from wood heating are very significant in Vermont. The Vermont Department of Health estimated that it accounts for $100 to $300 million in health costs annually just from wood heating. And this law would incentivize advanced wood heating, which numerous studies by NESCAM and others have shown aren't actually protective of public health, don't necessarily reduce PM 2.5 emissions. I still haven't seen the tag address this important issue, even though the statute specifically mandates that the tag consider health impacts. But I'm curious of a question for the NV5 gentlemen about whether these impacts, the potential impacts from moving to more wood heating, has been considered in this report. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, if you'll just hold your response and we'll get our final comment from Ashley Adams.
Hi, yeah, this is Ashley Adams. I live in Burlington. Thank you for taking my comment today. Like most Vermonters, I was not able to attend today's meeting, but I want to at least weigh in to comment here. I noticed that NV5 uses the first environment study and thus continues to perpetuate the lie that stack pollution from wood burning is somehow carbon neutral. Opinion Dynamics also perpetuates this flawed carbon accounting, and in reality, carbon pollution from wood burning is worse than any fossil fuel, as you've just heard and will continue to hear from many people. EPA data on stack emissions from McNeil, the coal plant, the what I consider a coal plant in my hometown, that emissions data is publicly available on the EPA website. It's no secret to any of us. You can't fool the atmosphere and you can't ignore the laws of physics. The carbon emissions released today cause immediate and irreversible damage to our climate. Moreover, the trees felled and burned immediately stop absorbing carbon and being home to the biodiversity that we rely upon for survival. Trees, intact forests, are what scientists consider our children's insurance policy, really. And as a mom, we really need to recognize this. Relying on faulty information with regard to wood burning, as the state of Vermont continues to do, is more than just tipping the scales in favor of the forestry industry. It really is deliberately ignoring long-established science and intentionally deceiving Vermonters. This is the sort of climate denialism that we've long expected from the likes of ExxonMobil and their ilk, and evidently what we can continue to expect here in the Green Mountain State. If you cheat, of course you'll reach the finish line first, but I hope that we can all agree that cheating is morally reprehensible, especially when it cheats our children out of a future. Thank you.
Thank you for the public comments, and I just want to give NV5 an opportunity to respond to some of the questions that were raised, or if you have any reaction to the comments.
Yeah, I can just say a few words in response to Jared. I think you said it when you said in some cases it may be appropriate for incentives to cover full installed costs of measures. And I think that's what we're representing here, is that upper boundary, and acknowledging that in a implemented, well-implemented program, targeting those who might be more willing to pay, those dollars wouldn't need to be funneled through incentives. So I agree with that, and I acknowledge that. I also want to say that for full replacement electrification projects, the full cost of installation looks pretty close to an incremental cost, even if we were to assume that if somebody's existing furnace failed. It's the difference of maybe $20,000 for an incremental cost versus $25,000 for a full installed. So yes, it does have an impact, and yes, it might reduce what you need to pay on an incremental basis, but it's still a large differential. It's not like we're talking about trying to in the olden days promote somebody install a more efficient air conditioner, central air conditioner upon the failure of their existing unit. That's a pop in out replacement. You gain an incremental efficiency and you're just paying that incremental cost. So your incentives it's a much more capital intensive undertaking to fuel switch, not just on the cost side, but in terms of planning ahead. A lot of times there is a lot of pre-design that needs to happen. So if you are in the middle of winter and your heat goes out, you're probably not likely to be a candidate for a heat pump. So with those considerations, that's part of the motivation for why we modeled things as discretionary retrofits. It's kind of using that logic to guide those assumptions. But I certainly do acknowledge again that there are opportunities to reduce program budgets below what was modeled. And again, I would suggest viewing those as an upper boundary.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you all, members of the public. Thank you for your comments. Thank you again, NV5 and the department and everybody. I'd like to bring the meeting to a close with two questions. One is, are there any particular agenda items you want us to add to the agenda for the next meeting? And if you don't have thoughts at the moment, please send them to Catherine and Emily and me. And two, we have talked about, among some of us, I can't remember if this came up in the last meeting, but I think it did. We've talked about the possibility of adding a third meeting this month, which would be the last Thursday in September. We don't have to make a decision at this moment. I'm thinking we're going to need it. There are a lot of issues to be taken up still. I hope folks can set aside that time. I think it's on the 26th, if I recall correctly. But if we want to take a straw poll right now of where folks sit on that, that'd be great. Emily, Roscoe?
Yeah, before we do that straw poll, I know Emily Levin asked this earlier, but TJ, can you just clarify for us one more time if there are questions that we have in addition to today's meeting? Is there an opportunity to ask those for NV5?
Yeah, well, I haven't talked with NV5 about this specifically, but we'll take questions and answer what we can and bounce other questions if we can't answer it off of them if they're available to answer. And so, yeah, please do send us your questions and feedback.
Folks
Via
should
email?
communicate with you directly.
There is our email, the PSD clean heat at vermont.gov. I will just put that in the chat really quickly.
Right.
Is the
Thank
best
you.
way. There's somebody checking that all the time. You might get a faster response than.
Thanks for repeating that.
Right.
So
Thanks.
Laura, I see your comment. You had a specific question. I think at this point, because we've gone so far over, if you would submit it the way it has just been requested by TJ, that would be helpful. And then you'll be sure to get a response. So straw poll on whether or not to have a third meeting.
And Catherine, just to check, we would normally be meeting on October 3rd and 17th. Is that right?
It would be 3 meetings in a row, Emily. It would be
Okay.
It would be 3 meetings in a row. If we,
Yeah, I just wanted to flag that we don't seem to have any meetings on the agenda after September, so we should go ahead and get those invitations updated as well.
right. Good point. Good point. Every 2 weeks. So, in anticipation of some, detailed work and discussion and debate over a number of things, obviously carbon intensities of biofuels being one of them. I'd like to at least reserve that Thursday, the 26th, for another meeting. If there's a groundswell of opposition to that, of course, that's fine. But any thoughts in particular from members?
What time would that be?
Oh, we can make it later for you or earlier. Should we make it earlier, Brian, at 9 instead of 9:30?
Well, Patrick's not on to manage my schedule anymore. But I'm only available in the afternoon that day.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well,
But the world doesn't revolve around me, as we know.
I think keeping it at our current time might be most effective. Otherwise, we'll just have to do some sort
Google.
of survey of everybody and reschedule the entire, maybe the day and the time.
let's keep it at the normal time. Sorry, Brian, just it does make things a bit easier, but let's everybody pencil that in. And in the next few days, when we work through the agenda for the next meeting, we'll have I think, a better sense of what we might need for an interim meeting. With that, unless there's anything else from folks, and thank you for your 20 minutes of extra time. I want to thank everybody for a productive meeting, public, NV5, and of course, TAG members. So thank you very much. And Catherine as well. Enjoy.
Thanks all.